Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been with the Mikosaki Tribal Police for 8 years now, and in that time, I've learned that the Everglades doesn't give up its secrets easily. The swamp is a living thing, breathing and shifting with the seasons, swallowing up anything foolish enough to venture too deep into its murky heart. Most people who go missing out here either turn up within 48 hours, dehydrated and mosquito-bitten but alive, or they don't turn up at all. The gators see to that. But this case, the one that came across my desk on a humid Tuesday morning in late September, was different from the start. I could feel it in my bones, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky even darkens. The missing person was a man named Byron Redfeather, 53 years old, a charter fishing guide who'd been working the waters around the reservation for the better part of 2 decades. Byron was well known in the community, not just because he was good at what he did, but because he kept to himself in a way that made people trust him. He wasn't the type to get drunk and wander off into the sawgrass, and he damn sure wasn't the type to abandon his boat in the middle of a job. But that's exactly what had happened. A tourist couple from Ohio had hired him for a sunrise fishing trip, and when they arrived at the designated dock at 5:30 a.m., Byron's boat was there. Engine still warm, tackle box open, but no Byron. His cell phone was on the seat, his wallet tucked in the console, and his favorite fishing rod, the one he'd had since he was a teenager, was lying across the bow like he'd just set it down for a moment. The couple waited for an hour before calling it in, thinking maybe he'd gone to relieve himself or check something on the shoreline. But when the sun climbed higher and the heat started pressing down like a wet blanket, they knew something was wrong. That's when dispatch called me. "Officer Talon Osceola," they said. "We've got a possible missing person at the Cypress dock." I grabbed my gear, radioed that I was en route, and headed out in my patrol truck. The drive took 20 minutes, winding through the back roads that cut through the reservation, past the scattering of houses and trailers that made up our small community. The air was thick with moisture, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've even done anything, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue that promised rain by afternoon. When I arrived at the dock, the Ohio couple was sitting in the shade of a cypress tree, looking worried and sunburned. The woman kept fanning herself with a folded map, and the man was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to get a signal. I introduced myself, showed them my badge, and asked them to walk me through everything again from the beginning. They told me the same story, nothing unusual, nothing out of place except for the fact that Byron Redfeather had simply vanished. I took down their contact information, told them I'd be in touch, and sent them back to their hotel. Then I turned my attention to the boat. It was a 16-foot aluminum fishing skiff, the kind you see all over the Everglades, nothing fancy, but reliable. The engine was a Yamaha outboard, well maintained, and the hull was freshly scrubbed. Byron took pride in his work. That much was obvious. I stepped aboard carefully, not wanting to disturb anything that might be evidence, and started my examination. The tackle box was open. Flies and lures scattered across the bottom of the boat like someone had been in the middle of rigging a line. The cooler in the stern was half full of ice and bottled water, and there was a sandwich wrapped in plastic sitting on the bench seat, untouched. Byron's phone was a basic flip model, the kind older guys around here still preferred, and when I opened it I saw he had 3 missed calls, all from the same number. I recognized it. It was his ex-wife, a woman named Della, who lived over in Fort Lauderdale. I bagged the phone as evidence and continued my search. That's when I noticed the blood. It wasn't much, just a few drops on the edge of the console, dried dark brown in the heat. My pulse quickened. Blood could mean a lot of things out here. A fishing accident, a slip with a knife, even a run-in with a gator if Byron had been foolish enough to get too close to one. But something about the placement bothered me. The drops were smeared, like someone had tried to wipe them away but hadn't quite succeeded. I took photos with my department-issued camera, making sure to capture every angle, every detail. Then I called it in to dispatch and requested a forensics team, even though I knew it would take them hours to get out here. While I waited, I decided to talk to the locals. The Cypress Dock wasn't exactly a bustling hub of activity, but there were a few houses nearby, and I figured someone might have seen or heard something. The first place I stopped was a weathered blue trailer about 100 yards from the water, half hidden by a tangle of palmetto bushes and Spanish moss. An old woman answered my knock, her face lined and leathery from decades in the sun. Her name was May Hummingbird, and she was one of the reservation elders, someone who'd been around long enough to remember when this area was nothing but wilderness. May invited me inside, insisting I sit down and have some sweet tea before we talked. I didn't want to be rude, so I accepted, sipping the cold drink while she settled into a rocking chair by the window. She asked me about my family, about my mother who she'd known when I was a boy, and I answered her questions patiently, knowing that this was how things worked around here. You didn't just barge in and start interrogating people. You showed respect. You listened. You let the conversation unfold naturally. After a few minutes, I gently steered us toward the reason for my visit. May's expression darkened when I mentioned Byron's name. She told me she'd seen Byron the night before, around sunset, standing at the end of the dock and staring out at the water. She said he looked troubled, like something was weighing on him, and when she called out to him, he didn't respond. She thought maybe he hadn't heard her, so she went back inside and didn't think much of it. But then, in the middle of the night, she heard something. It was around 3 a.m. and she'd gotten up to use the bathroom when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a voice, she said, a man's voice, calling out from somewhere near the water. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, almost pleading. She looked out her window but couldn't see anything in the darkness, and by the time she'd put on her robe and stepped outside, the sound had stopped. I asked her if she'd heard anything else, any boats, any engines, anything that might explain what happened to Byron. She shook her head slowly, her eyes distant, and then she said something that sent a chill down my spine despite the oppressive heat. She said, "Officer Osceola, that man was running from something." I could see it in his eyes. Whatever it was, it caught up with him. I thanked May for her time, finished my tea, and headed back to the dock, her words echoing in my mind. Running from something. What the hell did that mean? The forensics team arrived just before noon. 2 techs from the main office in Miami who looked about as comfortable in the swamp as a couple of tourists. They dusted the boat for prints, collected the blood samples, and took measurements of everything while I stood by and watched. One of them, a young guy with thick glasses and a clipboard, asked me if I thought this was an accident or something more. I told him I didn't know yet, but the longer I stood there in the heat, the more I felt like May was right. Byron hadn't just wandered off. Something had happened to him, something deliberate. By the time the techs packed up and left, the sky had turned gray and heavy, the promised rain finally rolling in. I stayed at the dock for another hour, walking the shoreline, looking for any sign of a struggle or a trail leading into the swamp. I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no indication that anyone had even been here besides Byron and his clients. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. I radioed dispatch and told them I was heading back to the station to file my report, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Some crucial detail that was staring me right in the face. Back at the station, I spent the rest of the afternoon going through Byron's records. He had a clean history. No arrests, no complaints, nothing that would suggest he was involved in anything illegal. His financials were in order, no unusual transactions, no large debts. The only thing that stood out was a note in his file from 3 years ago, a domestic disturbance call involving his ex-wife, Della. According to the report, she'd called the police claiming Byron was harassing her, showing up at her house unannounced, calling her at all hours. But when the responding officer arrived, Byron was calm and cooperative, and Della eventually dropped the complaint. The officer noted that it seemed like a case of a bad breakup rather than anything serious. I decided to give Della a call. She answered on the third ring, her voice wary when I identified myself. I explained that Byron was missing and that I was trying to piece together his last movements. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she asked, "Is he dead?" I told her I didn't know, but that we were treating it as a missing person case for now. She let out a breath, something between relief and sadness, and then she started talking. She told me that Byron had been calling her again recently, starting about 2 months ago. At first, it was just once or twice a week, always late at night, always rambling about the past, about mistakes he'd made. She said he sounded scared, which wasn't like him at all. Byron was the kind of man who didn't scare easily. I pressed her for details, and she hesitated before finally telling me that Byron had mentioned something about seeing someone. Not seeing as in dating, she clarified, but seeing as in spotting someone from his past, someone he thought was dead. She said he wouldn't give her a name, just kept saying that it was impossible, that this person couldn't be here, couldn't be real. Della thought he was losing his mind, maybe early onset dementia or something, so she stopped answering his calls. The last time they spoke was 2 weeks ago, and he'd left her a voicemail that she hadn't listened to yet. I asked her if she could send it to me, and she agreed, her voice shaking slightly. The voicemail arrived in my email an hour later. I played it on my computer, the volume turned up, and listened as Byron's voice filled the small office. He sounded exhausted, his words slurred slightly like he'd been drinking. "Della," he said, "I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to listen. I saw him again. He was at the dock yesterday, just standing there, watching me. I don't know how, but it's him. I thought I buried this. I thought it was over, but it's not. He's back, and I don't know what to do." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of wind and water, and then Byron's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "If something happens to me, you need to know the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was never an accident." And then the voicemail ended. I sat back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, my mind racing. What accident was he talking about? And who the hell was this person he kept seeing? I pulled up Byron's file again, this time digging deeper into his background. That's when I found it, a newspaper article from 1998 buried in the archives of the tribal records. The headline read, "Local man dies in boating accident on Mikosuke waters." I clicked on the article and started reading. The victim was a 24-year-old fisherman named Marcus Osceola. My stomach dropped. Osceola, that was my family name. I kept reading, my hands trembling slightly. Marcus had been out on the water with 2 friends, Byron Redfeather and another man whose name wasn't mentioned in the article. According to the report, Marcus had fallen overboard during a sudden storm, and by the time his friends realized what had happened, he'd been swept away by the current. His body was never recovered. The case was ruled an accidental drowning, and no charges were filed. But now, sitting in this cramped office with the rain pounding on the roof, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. Marcus Osceola was my older brother. He died 2 years before I was born, and my parents rarely talked about him. When I was a kid, I'd asked my mom about the brother I'd never met, and she'd just shaken her head and said it was too painful to discuss. I never pushed, figuring it was one of those family tragedies that people preferred to bury. But now, hearing Byron's voicemail, seeing his name linked to my brother's death, I felt a knot forming in my chest. Had Byron been running from the truth all these years? And if so, what really happened out on that water in '98? I decided I needed to talk to my mother. She was the only one left who might be able to give me answers. I called her that evening, and when she heard the tension in my voice, she agreed to meet me the next morning at her house. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept playing Byron's voicemail over and over, trying to make sense of his words. I thought I buried this. What did he bury? The truth about Marcus's death? Evidence? A body? The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the rain from the previous day leaving everything slick and muddy. I drove to my mother's house, a small one-story on the edge of the reservation, and found her waiting for me on the porch. She looked older than I remembered, her hair almost entirely gray now, her hands wrinkled and spotted with age. She poured me a cup of coffee, and we sat together in silence for a few minutes, watching the mist rise off the swamp. Then I told her everything. About Byron's disappearance, about the voicemail, about the article I'd found. When I finished, she set her coffee cup down and closed her eyes. She told me a story I'd never heard before. She said that Marcus had been best friends with Byron Redfeather since they were boys. They did everything together, fishing, hunting, getting into trouble like young men do. But in the months before Marcus died, something changed. Byron started acting strange, distant, and Marcus confided in her that he thought Byron was involved in something illegal. She didn't know the details, Marcus wouldn't say, but he was planning to confront Byron about it. A week later, Marcus was dead. My mother said she never believed it was an accident. She thought Byron had something to do with it, but she had no proof, and the tribal council ruled it accidental. She'd lived with that suspicion for 27 years, and it had eaten away at her. I sat there, processing everything she'd told me, feeling the weight of it settle on my shoulders. If my mother was right, if Byron had been responsible for Marcus's death, then what did that mean for his disappearance now? Was this some kind of karmic justice, the swamp finally claiming him the way it claimed my brother? Or was there something else going on, something darker that I hadn't uncovered yet? I thanked my mother, hugged her tight, and promised I'd get to the bottom of this. As I drove back to the station, I knew one thing for certain. This case wasn't just about finding a missing fisherman anymore. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for nearly 3 decades, and I had a feeling that truth was going to be uglier than anything I'd seen in my 8 years on the force. The next 48 hours were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and dead ends. I'd put out a bolo for Byron Redfeather across 3 counties, checked with every hospital and morgue within 100 miles, and come up with nothing. It was like the man had simply dissolved into the humid Florida air. But I couldn't let it go, not now that I knew about the connection to my brother Marcus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that newspaper article from 1998, the grainy photo of my brother's face staring back at me, forever frozen at 24 years old. I'd spent my entire life walking in the shadow of a ghost I'd never known, and now that ghost was pulling me deeper into something I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. On Thursday morning, I got a call from the forensics lab in Miami. The blood samples from Byron's boat had come back, and they were a match for Byron's DNA, which we'd pulled from a toothbrush at his apartment. The amount of blood wasn't enough to suggest a fatal injury, maybe a deep cut or a bad nosebleed, but it confirmed that something had happened on that boat. The tech also mentioned that they'd found traces of soil on the deck, a specific type of clay-rich mud that was common in the deeper parts of the Everglades, the kind of places where the water turned black and the cypress trees grew so thick you couldn't see the sky. That detail stuck with me. Byron was an experienced guide. He knew better than to take his boat into those treacherous areas, especially alone. I decided to expand my search. If Byron had gone into the deep swamp, there were only a few access points he could have used, and most of them required local knowledge to navigate. I pulled up a map of the reservation and marked every spot where the water was deep enough for a boat, but shallow enough to beach if you needed to. There were 5 locations that fit the criteria, all of them at least an hour's drive from the cypress dock. I grabbed my gear, loaded up the patrol truck with extra water and a first aid kit, and headed out. The sky was overcast again, the air thick with the promise of more rain, and the radio crackled with scattered reports of afternoon thunderstorms moving in from the Gulf. The first 3 locations turned up nothing. Just empty stretches of water and tangled vegetation, the kind of primordial landscape that looked the same as it had 1,000 years ago. But at the 4th spot, a narrow inlet called Heron's Rest, I found something that made my pulse quicken. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud near the water's edge, deep grooves that suggested a boat trailer had been backed down to the shoreline recently. I got out of the truck and examined the tracks more closely. They were maybe 2 or 3 days old, right around the time Byron had disappeared. I followed them down to the water and found scrape marks on a half-submerged log, the kind of marks a boat hull might leave if someone had launched in a hurry. I radioed dispatch and requested a patrol boat, telling them I needed to search the waterways around Heron's Rest. It took an hour for the boat to arrive, piloted by a young officer named Kai Brightwing, who'd been with the department for less than a year. Kai was eager, maybe a little too eager, but he knew the water well, and I trusted him to keep us from running aground. We loaded our gear into the boat and set off into the winding channels that snaked through the swamp. The water here was darker than at the cypress dock, stained the color of strong tea by the tannins leaching from the vegetation, and the air smelled of decay and wet earth. We'd been searching for about 30 minutes when Kai spotted something caught in the roots of a mangrove tree. It was a piece of fabric, faded blue denim, torn and waterlogged. I pulled the boat closer and used a stick to fish it out. The fabric was from a shirt, and there was a name tag sewn into the collar, the kind you'd get embroidered at a uniform shop. It read Red Feather Guide Services. My stomach tightened. This was Byron's shirt, or at least part of it. I bagged it as evidence and told Kai to keep moving. If we'd found his shirt, there was a good chance we'd find more. Another 20 minutes passed, the boat's motor humming softly as we drifted through the narrow channels. The canopy of trees overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving us in a perpetual twilight that made it hard to judge distances. Then Kai pointed ahead, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Officer Osceola, look." I followed his gaze and saw it. A small wooden platform built into the trees about 50 yards ahead, the kind of hunting blind locals use during gator season. But something was wrong. The platform was too neat, too deliberate for a hunting blind, and there was a tarp stretched over part of it, creating a makeshift shelter. We approached slowly, the boat gliding through the water with barely a ripple. When we got close enough, I called out, identifying myself as tribal police and asking if anyone was there. No response. I tied the boat to a low-hanging branch and climbed onto the platform, my boots squelching in the damp wood. Kai stayed in the boat, his hand resting on his sidearm, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The platform was about 10 feet square, elevated maybe 8 feet above the water line, and it was covered with debris, old tarps, empty water bottles, a rusted Coleman stove. Someone had been camping here, and recently. Under the tarp, I found a sleeping bag and a duffel bag stuffed with clothes. I opened the duffel carefully, not wanting to contaminate any evidence, and pulled out a flannel shirt, a pair of jeans, and a wallet. I opened the wallet and felt my blood run cold. The driver's license inside belonged to Byron Redfeather. But if this was his campsite, where the hell was he? I searched the rest of the platform, looking for any clue that might tell me what had happened. That's when I found the notebook. It was a cheap, spiral-bound thing, the pages warped and stained with moisture, and it was filled with the handwriting I recognized from Byron's missing person report. I sat down on the edge of the platform and started reading. The entries were dated, starting about 3 weeks ago. Byron wrote about seeing someone he called the Ghost, a man he described as impossible, someone who should have been dead. He didn't use a name, just kept referring to him as the Ghost, and the entries grew more frantic as the days went on. Byron wrote about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps outside his apartment at night, about finding strange marks carved into the trees near his favorite fishing spots. He was convinced that someone was stalking him, someone who knew about what happened in 1998. The final entry was dated the day before Byron disappeared, and it was just one sentence, written in shaky, uneven letters. He found me. I can't run anymore. I closed the notebook and looked out at the dark water surrounding us. The pieces were starting to come together, but they formed a picture I didn't want to see. Byron had been hiding out here, running from someone or something connected to my brother's death. But who, and why now, after all these years? I climbed back into the boat and told Kai we needed to keep searching. If Byron had been staying on this platform, there was a chance he was still nearby, either hiding or worse. We searched for another 2 hours, covering every inlet and channel within a mile of the platform. The storm clouds that had been threatening all day finally opened up, drenching us in a cold, driving rain that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I was about to call it off and head back when Kai shouted over the sound of the rain. He was pointing at something floating in the water ahead, something pale and bobbing just below the surface. My heart sank. I knew what it was before we even got close. It was a body, face down in the water, the back of the shirt torn and stained with something dark. I maneuvered the boat alongside it and, with Kai's help, hauled it onto the deck. We turned it over, and I found myself staring into the bloated, fish-nibbled face of Byron Redfeather. His eyes were open and clouded, his skin a mottled gray-blue, and there was a deep gash across his throat, the edges jagged and uneven. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drowning. Byron Redfeather had been murdered. I radioed dispatch immediately, my voice tight as I reported the discovery. They told me to secure the scene and wait for the coroner and the investigative team, which would take at least an hour given our location. Kai and I covered the body with a tarp and sat in the rain, neither of us speaking. I kept thinking about the notebook, about Byron's final entry. He found me. Who had found him? Who had... And what did they do to him before they slit his throat and dumped him in the water? The investigative team arrived just as the rain began to ease. They photographed the body, took measurements, and carefully loaded Byron onto a stretcher for transport back to the coroner's office. The lead investigator, a grizzled veteran named Thomas Kincaid, pulled me aside and asked for a rundown of everything I'd found. I told him about the platform, the notebook, the connection to my brother's death in 1998. Kincaid listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he just nodded slowly. "This is bigger than a missing person case," he said. "You know that, right?" I nodded. I'd known it from the moment I heard Byron's voicemail. Back at the station that evening, I sat in my office and stared at the evidence bags spread across my desk. Byron's wallet, his notebook, the torn piece of his shirt. Each one a piece of a puzzle I was starting to dread completing. I opened the notebook again and read through the entries more carefully, looking for any detail I might have missed. One passage stood out, dated about 10 days before Byron's disappearance. He wrote, "I saw him at May's place tonight, standing in her yard, staring at her window." She didn't see him, but I did. He's older now, but it's him. I'd know that face anywhere, same eyes, same walk. He's come back to finish what he started. May Hummingbird, the elder who'd told me about hearing a voice calling out in the night. I needed to talk to her again, but this time with more specific questions. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m., too late to be knocking on an old woman's door. But this couldn't wait. I grabbed my jacket and headed back out into the night. The drive to May's trailer felt longer than it should have, every shadow on the road making me tense, every sound from the swamp putting me on edge. When I pulled up to her place, I saw that the lights were on, a soft, yellow glow spilling from the windows. I knocked on the door and waited. After a moment, May's voice called out, asking who it was. I identified myself, and she opened the door a crack, her face suspicious until she recognized me. She let me in, and I could tell she'd been expecting bad news. I told her about finding Byron's body, about the notebook and his entries mentioning her house. Her face went pale, and she sank into her rocking chair, one hand pressed to her chest. She was silent for a long time, and then she started talking. She told me that about 2 weeks ago, she'd noticed someone lurking around her property at night. She hadn't gotten a good look at him, just a shape in the darkness, but she'd felt watched. She'd mentioned it to Byron when she saw him at the dock, and he'd gone pale, asked her to describe what she'd seen. When she did, he'd told her to lock her doors and not go outside after dark. I asked her if she'd seen this person again. She shook her head, but then she hesitated. She said that the night Byron disappeared, the night she'd heard that desperate voice calling out, she'd looked out her window and seen something else. A boat moving slowly through the water with no lights, just a dark shape gliding past. She'd assumed it was Byron, maybe coming back from a late fishing trip, but now she wasn't so sure. I thanked May and told her to call me immediately if she saw or heard anything unusual. As I left her trailer and walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the darkness, someone was keeping tabs on me just like they'd kept tabs on Byron. The next morning, I met with Thomas Kincaid and the rest of the investigative team. The coroner's preliminary report confirmed what I'd suspected. Byron had been killed elsewhere and his body dumped in the water. The gash on his throat was made with a serrated blade, possibly a fishing knife, and he'd been dead for at least 36 hours before we found him. There were also defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, indicating he'd fought back. Kincaid spread a series of photos across the conference table, close-ups of Byron's injuries, and pointed to something I'd missed at the scene. There were marks on Byron's wrists, ligature marks, like he'd been tied up before he was killed. This was torture, Kincaid said. Someone wanted information from him before they killed him. The question is, what information? I didn't have an answer, but I had a theory. I pulled out the newspaper article from 1998, the one about my brother Marcus's death, and laid it next to the photos. I told the team about the connection, about Byron's voicemail, about the entries in his notebook. Kincaid studied the article, his jaw tight, and then he looked up at me. "You think this is revenge?" he asked. "Someone connected to your brother coming back to settle a score?" I said I didn't know, but it was the only thing that made sense. Kincaid assigned 2 more officers to the case and told me to dig into the third man who'd been on the boat with Byron and Marcus in 1998. The newspaper article hadn't named him, but there had to be a police report somewhere with his identity. I spent the rest of the day combing through old records, most of them still stored in dusty filing cabinets in the basement of the station. It took hours, but I finally found it. The third man's name was Curtis Longtree, and according to the report, he'd been the one to call in Marcus's drowning. He'd given a statement saying that a sudden storm had capsized the boat and Marcus had been swept away before they could save him. The case was closed as accidental, and Curtis had left the reservation shortly after, relocating to somewhere in Georgia. I ran a background check on Curtis Longtree and found that he'd died 4 years ago. Heart attack. Nothing suspicious. But he had a son, a man in his early 30s named Ethan Longtree, who still had ties to the area. I pulled Ethan's records and found a current address in Homestead, about an hour south of the reservation. I grabbed my jacket and told Kincaid I was heading out to interview him. He told me to take backup, but I declined. I wanted to approach this carefully, and showing up with a fleet of patrol cars would only put Ethan on the defensive. The drive to Homestead took me through miles of flat, open country, the kind of landscape that made you feel exposed and small. Ethan Longtree's address turned out to be a run-down duplex on the edge of town, the yard overgrown and the paint peeling off the siding. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching the house. There was a pickup truck in the driveway, rusted and covered in mud, and a light on in one of the windows. I got out, crossed the street, and knocked on the door. After a long pause, it opened, and I found myself face to face with a lean, hard-looking man with dark eyes and a guarded expression. I identified myself and asked if he was Ethan Longtree. He nodded slowly, his hand resting on the door frame like he was ready to slam it shut at any moment. I told him I was investigating the death of Byron Redfeather, and that I wanted to ask him a few questions about his father. Ethan's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition maybe, or fear. He stepped back and let me inside. The duplex was sparsely furnished, just a couch, a TV, and a small kitchen table covered with empty beer cans. Ethan gestured for me to sit, and I took a chair while he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I asked him when he'd last seen Byron, and he said it had been years, not since he was a kid. I asked him about his father, about what Curtis had told him about the night Marcus Osceola died. Ethan was quiet for a long time, and then he started talking. He said his father had been haunted by that night for the rest of his life, that he'd never been able to let it go. Curtis had told Ethan bits and pieces over the years, usually when he was drunk, and the story that emerged was very different from the official report. According to Curtis, it wasn't a storm that killed Marcus. It was Byron. Ethan said his father claimed that Byron and Marcus had gotten into a fight on the boat. Something about money Marcus thought Byron owed him. The fight turned physical, and Marcus went overboard. But Byron didn't try to save him. Instead, he held Marcus under the water until he stopped struggling. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My brother hadn't drowned in an accident. He'd been murdered. And Byron Redfeather, the man whose disappearance I'd been investigating, was the one who killed him. I asked Ethan why Curtis had never come forward with this information, why he'd lied to the police. Ethan shrugged and said his father was scared. Byron had threatened him, told him that if he ever said anything, he'd end up in the water too. So Curtis kept quiet, moved away, and tried to forget. But he never did. I asked Ethan the question that had been burning in my mind since I started reading Byron's notebook. Do you know anyone who might have wanted Byron dead? Someone connected to your father or to Marcus? Ethan's expression darkened, and he looked away. After a moment, he said, "My father had a brother, my uncle. He lived out on the reservation for years, kept to himself mostly. But he knew what happened to Marcus. My dad told him before he died. And my uncle, he's the kind of man who believes in justice, the old kind, the kind you don't get from a courtroom." I felt a chill run through me. I asked Ethan for his uncle's name and last known location. He hesitated, then said, "His name is Raymond Longtree. Last I heard, he was living somewhere in the Everglades off the grid. I haven't seen him in a couple of years." I thanked Ethan for his time and left the duplex, my mind racing. Raymond Longtree. The ghost Byron had been running from. The man who'd come back to settle a score that was almost 3 decades old. I got in my truck and called Kincaid, filling him in on everything Ethan had told me. Kincaid swore under his breath and told me he'd put out a warrant for Raymond Longtree's arrest. But as I drove back toward the reservation, I couldn't shake the feeling that finding Raymond wasn't going to be easy. The Everglades was a big place, full of hidden camps and forgotten trails, and if Raymond wanted to stay hidden, he could do it for years. I thought about Byron's notebook, about the entries describing being watched and stalked. Raymond had been playing a long game, tormenting Byron before finally moving in for the kill. And now that Byron was dead, what was Raymond's next move? Was he satisfied, or was there someone else on his list? That question was answered sooner than I expected. When I got back to the station, there was a message waiting for me on my desk. It was from May Hummingbird, and her voice on the voicemail was shaking. "Officer Osceola," she said, "he's back. I saw him tonight, standing at the edge of my yard. Same man I saw before. He was just standing there, staring at my house. I'm scared. Please come." I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, my heart pounding. If Raymond Longtree was at May's house, I had a chance to end this tonight. The drive to May Hummingbird's trailer felt like it took forever, even though I had the lights flashing and my foot pressed hard on the accelerator. The night was thick and dark, the kind of darkness you only get in the deep swamp where there are no streetlights and the trees block out the moon. My radio crackled with static as I tried to raise dispatch, but the signal was weak out here, cutting in and out with bursts of white noise. I called for backup anyway, knowing it would take at least 20 minutes for another unit to arrive, and told them to approach with caution. If Raymond Longtree was really at May's place, and if he was the one who'd killed Byron, then he was dangerous and likely armed. When I pulled up to May's property, I killed the lights and the engine, letting the truck coast to a stop about 50 yards from the trailer. I didn't want to announce my arrival if Raymond was still around. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, checking that I had a full magazine before stepping out into the humid night air. The swamp was alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the distant bellow of a gator, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. But underneath all that natural noise, there was a silence that felt wrong, a held breath quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I approached the trailer slowly, keeping to the shadows and scanning the yard for any sign of movement. May's porch light was on, casting a weak yellow glow across the front steps, but the rest of the property was dark. I could see her silhouette through the window, sitting in her rocking chair, and for a moment I felt a wave of relief. She was alive. But then I noticed something else. She wasn't moving. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring straight ahead. I quickened my pace, my hand tightening on my weapon, and climbed the steps to her door. I knocked softly and called out her name. "May, it's Officer Osceola. Are you all right?" There was no response. I tried the door and found it unlocked, which sent another spike of alarm through my chest. May always locked her door, especially after dark. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping across the small living room. May was still in her chair, but now I could see her face, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her mouth hanging slightly open, and there was a thin line of blood trailing from her nose down to her chin. I rushed to her side and checked for a pulse, but I already knew what I'd find. She was dead. Her skin still warm, but her body lifeless. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't a natural death. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible wounds, except for that trickle of blood from her nose. It looked almost like she'd been frightened to death, but I knew that wasn't possible. Something had happened here. something that had killed May Hummingbird in her own home while she sat in her rocking chair. I pulled out my radio and called it in, my voice tight as I reported another body. Dispatch confirmed that backup was en route, ETA 15 minutes, and told me to secure the scene and wait. But I couldn't just wait. Not when Raymond Longtree might still be nearby. I swept the rest of the trailer, checking every room, every closet, every corner where someone might be hiding. The place was empty except for May's body in the living room. But in the kitchen, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the table, arranged in a neat circle, were 5 small bones. They looked like finger bones, yellowed with age, and strung together with a piece of leather cord. Next to them was a note, handwritten on a scrap of paper torn from what looked like Byron's notebook. The handwriting was different from Byron's, sharper and more deliberate, and the message was simple. She knew too much. You're next. I photographed the bones and the note with my phone, then bagged them as evidence. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger. Raymond Longtree had killed May because she'd seen him, because she could identify him. And now he was threatening me. This had stopped being about justice for my brother and turned into something darker, something personal. I thought about May's kindness, the way she'd welcomed me into her home and shared her sweet tea and her stories. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. Backup arrived 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cars with lights flashing. The officers swept the property while I stayed with May's body, waiting for the coroner. Thomas Kincaid showed up shortly after, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He looked at the bones and the note, and then he looked at me. "This guy is playing with you," he said. "He wants you to know he's in control." I nodded, my jaw tight. I said, "He made a mistake, though. He left evidence. Those bones, they're old, probably decades old. If we can figure out where they came from, we might be able to track him down." Kincaid agreed and told me to send the bones to the forensics lab first thing in the morning. The coroner arrived and began his examination of May's body. After a few minutes, he called us over and pointed to a small puncture wound on the side of her neck, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. "Injection site," he said. I'd bet money she was given something, probably a sedative or a paralytic. It would have been quick and relatively painless, but it would have left her conscious long enough to see her killer. I felt sick. Raymond had wanted May to know she was dying, wanted her to see his face one last time before the drugs stopped her heart. This wasn't just murder. It was a message. I spent the rest of the night at the station, going through every piece of evidence we'd collected so far. Byron's notebook, the bones, the note, the fabric from his torn shirt. I spread everything out on the conference table and tried to find a pattern, something that would tell me where Raymond Longtree was hiding and what his next move would be. But the more I looked, the more I realized that Raymond had been planning this for a long time. Every detail was deliberate, every action calculated. He'd spent weeks, maybe months, stalking Byron and May, learning their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 3 a.m., I got a call from the forensics lab. The tech on duty told me that the bones I'd sent over were human, likely from a hand, and they were at least 25 to 30 years old based on the degradation. They'd found traces of swamp water minerals on them, suggesting they'd been submerged at some point. My heart sank. I knew whose bones they were before the tech even finished talking. They belonged to my brother Marcus. Raymond had recovered them from the Everglades, probably from the same area where Byron and Curtis had dumped his body all those years ago, and he'd kept them as a trophy or a reminder of what had been done. I thanked the tech and hung up, then sat in the dark office with my head in my hands. This case had started as a missing person investigation and had turned into something much bigger, a web of lies and murder that stretched back to before I was born. My brother had been killed by a man I'd spent the last week investigating, and now that man was dead too, murdered by someone seeking revenge. And in the middle of it all was Raymond Longtree, a ghost from the past who'd come back to settle old scores. I knew I should feel something, grief or anger or fear, but all I felt was a hollow numbness. The next morning, Kincaid called a briefing with the full investigative team. We had 6 officers now, all focused on finding Raymond Longtree before he could kill again. Kincaid laid out what we knew. Raymond was in his mid-50s, an experienced outdoorsman who'd lived on the reservation for most of his life before going off-grid about 5 years ago. He had no criminal record, no known associates, and no permanent address. He was a ghost in every sense of the word. But he'd made mistakes. He'd left the bones and the note, which meant he wanted to be found, or at least he wanted to taunt us. We divided up the search areas, focusing on the remote parts of the Everglades where someone could camp long-term without being noticed. I took the northern section, the area around Heron's Rest where we'd found Byron's body, figuring that Raymond might be using the same platform or a nearby location. Kincaid warned me to be careful, reminded me that Raymond had already killed 2 people and wouldn't hesitate to add a cop to his list. I nodded and headed out, my truck loaded with supplies for a long day in the swamp. The search was slow and methodical. I checked every hunting blind, every abandoned camp, every stretch of shoreline where someone might beach a boat. The heat was oppressive, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and your head pound with dehydration. I drank water constantly and kept moving, refusing to give up. Around midday, I found something interesting. There were fresh footprints in the mud near an old cypress stand, boot prints that were too large to be mine and too recent to have been left by Byron. I followed them inland, pushing through the dense undergrowth and keeping my hand near my weapon. The prints led me to a small clearing about a quarter mile from the water. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift camp, just a tarp strung between 2 trees and a fire pit ringed with stones. There were supplies scattered around, canned food, a sleeping bag, a duffel bag with clothes. I approached carefully, my weapon drawn, and called out, "Tribal police, if anyone's here, show yourself." No response. I checked the camp thoroughly and found more evidence that Raymond had been here recently. The fire pit still had warm ashes, and there was a half-eaten can of beans sitting on a log. He'd left in a hurry, probably within the last hour. I radioed Kincaid and gave him my location, telling him I'd found Raymond's camp. He told me to sit tight and wait for backup, but I knew that if I waited, Raymond would be long gone. I made a decision that I knew was risky, but felt necessary. I told Kincaid I was going to track him on foot and try to close the distance before he could disappear into the swamp. Kincaid started to argue, but I cut him off and turned off my radio. I wasn't going to let Raymond slip away, not when we were this close. I followed the boot prints deeper into the swamp, moving as quietly as I could. The terrain became more treacherous, the ground soft and waterlogged, the vegetation so thick it was like pushing through a living wall. I could hear the sounds of the swamp all around me, the buzz of insects, the splash of water, the creak of trees swaying in the breeze. And then I heard something else, the crack of a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, my heart pounding, and scanned the trees ahead. There, about 30 yards away, I saw movement. A figure dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly through the underbrush. I called out, identifying myself and ordering him to stop. The figure paused, then turned to face me. For the first time, I got a clear look at Raymond Longtree. He was tall and lean, with long gray hair tied back in a ponytail and a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were dark and intense, and when he looked at me, I felt like he could see straight through to my soul. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me, his hands hanging loose at his sides. I told him he was under arrest for the murders of Byron Redfeather and May Hummingbird. I told him to put his hands up and get down on his knees. But Raymond didn't move. Instead, he smiled, a cold, humorless expression that made my skin crawl. He said, "You look just like him, you know, just like Marcus. Same eyes, same stubbornness." I felt a jolt of shock run through me. He'd known my brother, known him well enough to recognize the resemblance even after all these years. I asked him why he'd killed Byron and May. Raymond's smile faded, and his expression turned hard. He said, "Justice, that's why. Your brother was my friend, one of the best men I ever knew. And Byron Redfeather murdered him in cold blood, then lied about it for 27 years. I couldn't let that stand." He paused, then added, "May saw me. She could have identified me. I couldn't risk that. I told him that didn't justify murder, that he should have gone to the police, let the law handle it." Raymond laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the trees. "The law," he said. "The law ruled it an accident. The law let Byron walk free." Where was justice then? I didn't have an answer for that. Part of me understood his rage, his need for revenge, but I also knew that what he'd done was wrong, that killing Byron and May hadn't brought my brother back, hadn't made anything right. I told Raymond he needed to come with me, that we could sort this out at the station, but even as I said it, I knew he wasn't going to comply. He took a step back, his hand moving toward his waistband, and I saw the glint of metal. He was armed. I drew my weapon and aimed it at his chest. "Don't do it," I said. "Don't make me shoot you." Raymond stopped, his hand hovering near his waistband, and for a moment we just stood there. Two men in the middle of the swamp, locked in a standoff that could only end one way. Then Raymond spoke again, his voice quiet and sad. "You want to know the truth, Officer Osceola? The whole truth?" I didn't respond, but he continued anyway. "Byron didn't act alone. There were 3 of them on that boat. Byron, Curtis, and one more. And that third man, he's the one who told Byron to do it. He's the one who gave the order." I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. A third man. Someone else who'd been involved in my brother's murder. Someone whose name had never appeared in any report. I asked Raymond who it was, but he just shook his head. "Find out yourself," he said. "Dig deep enough, and you'll find him. But be careful, officer. He's closer than you think." And then, before I could react, Raymond pulled a knife from his waistband and lunged toward me. I fired twice, the shots echoing through the swamp like thunder. Raymond stumbled and fell, the knife dropping from his hand. I rushed forward and kicked the knife away, then knelt beside him to check for a pulse. He was still alive, barely, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood was spreading across his shirt, dark and wet, and I knew he didn't have much time. I radioed for medical assistance, my voice shaking, and pressed my hands against his wounds to try to slow the bleeding. Raymond looked up at me, his eyes glazing over. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled up from his mouth. I leaned closer, straining to hear. He whispered, "Check the boat, the one from 98. It's still there, hidden in the deep water. Everything you need is on that boat." And then his eyes closed, and his breathing stopped. I sat back on my heels, my hands covered in blood, and stared at Raymond's lifeless body. I'd killed him, I'd had no choice, but that didn't make it any easier. The medical team arrived too late. They confirmed what I already knew: Raymond Longtree was dead. Kincaid showed up shortly after, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He asked me if I was all right, and I nodded, even though I wasn't sure that was true. I told him what Raymond had said about a third man, about the boat still being hidden in the swamp. Kincaid listened carefully, then said, "We'll find it. We'll get to the bottom of this. But first, you need to take some time. You've been through hell in the last week." I wanted to argue, wanted to keep searching, but I knew he was right. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and I needed to step back before I made a mistake. I agreed to take a few days off, but only if Kincaid promised to keep me updated on the investigation. He agreed, and I headed back to the station to file my report. The drive felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. I kept replaying the moment I'd pulled the trigger, kept seeing Raymond's face as the life drained out of him. Back at the station, I showered and changed into a clean uniform, washing the blood and swamp mud from my hands. Then I sat down at my desk and started writing the report, documenting everything that had happened from the moment I'd found Raymond's camp to the shooting. It took hours, and by the time I finished, the sun was setting outside the window, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I sent the report to Kincaid and then just sat there, staring at the wall. My phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was my mother. She'd heard about the shooting. News traveled fast on the reservation, and she wanted to know if I was all right. I told her I was fine, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. She asked me if I'd found out what really happened to Marcus, and I told her about Raymond's confession, about Byron's role in my brother's death. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she started crying, soft, broken sobs that made my chest ache. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said. "I'm so sorry." She told me it wasn't my fault, that I'd done everything I could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed somehow, that despite everything I'd uncovered, I still didn't have all the answers. There was still a third man out there, someone who'd been involved in Marcus's death and had never been held accountable. And according to Raymond, that man was closer than I thought. The question was, who? And how was I going to find him? I spent the next 2 days at home, trying to rest, but finding it impossible to quiet my mind. I kept thinking about Raymond's last words. Check the boat. It's still there, hidden in the deep water. Everything you need is on that boat. What did that mean? If the boat from 1998 was still out there, submerged somewhere in the Everglades, it could hold evidence that would finally reveal the truth about what happened to my brother. But finding it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. The swamp was vast and treacherous, and after 27 years, the boat could be anywhere. On the third day, Kincaid called me. He said the dive team had been searching the area around where Marcus's bones had been found, and they'd located something. A boat, half buried in the mud at the bottom of a deep channel, exactly where Raymond had said it would be. They were bringing it up and would have it at the forensics lab by the end of the day. I told Kincaid I wanted to be there when they examined it, and he agreed. This was my case, my family, and I had a right to see it through to the end. I drove to the forensics lab that evening, my stomach knotted with anticipation and dread. Kincaid met me at the entrance and led me to a large bay where the boat had been laid out on tarps. It was in bad shape, the hull corroded and covered in algae. The seats rotted through. But it was intact enough that we could see it was the same type of boat Byron had been using, a 16-foot aluminum fishing skiff. The forensics team had already started their examination, carefully documenting every inch of the wreckage. One of the techs called us over and pointed to something wedged under the console. It was a small, waterproof box, the kind fishermen use to store important documents or valuables. The tech pried it open, and inside we found a plastic bag containing a stack of papers and a cassette tape. The papers were waterlogged and partially dissolved, but I could make out enough to see they were financial records, receipts, and transaction slips dated from the mid-90s. And on one of the receipts I saw a name that made my blood run cold. It was the name of someone I knew, someone who still lived on the reservation. someone I'd seen almost every day for the past 8 years. The third man Raymond had mentioned, the one who'd given the order to kill my brother, wasn't some distant figure from the past. He was right here, hiding in plain sight, and tomorrow I was going to confront him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with the lights off, staring at the photocopy of the receipt I'd taken from the forensics lab, reading the name over and over again until the letters seemed to blur together. The name belonged to someone I'd trusted, someone who'd been part of the tribal police department for longer than I'd been alive, someone who'd mentored me when I first joined the force. His name was Gideon Greybird, and he was the current chief of the Miccosukee Tribal Police. My boss, my friend. And according to the evidence hidden in that waterlogged boat for 27 years, he was also the man who'd ordered my brother's murder. The receipt was dated August 12, 1998, just 2 days before Marcus died. It was from a marina in Fort Lauderdale, and it showed a cash payment of $5,000 for what was listed as boat repairs. But the handwriting on the receipt, the signature at the bottom, belonged to Gideon Greybird. The amount was far too large for simple repairs, and the timing was too coincidental to ignore. This was a payoff, money given to Byron Redfeather and Curtis Longtree to make sure Marcus Osceola never came back from that fishing trip. The question was why? What had my brother done? What had he known that made Gideon decide he had to die? I knew I should call Kincaid, bring him in on this immediately, but something held me back. If I made this accusation and I was wrong, if there was some other explanation for that receipt, I'd destroy not only my career, but also the reputation of a man who'd served this community for 4 decades. But if I was right, if Gideon really had orchestrated my brother's murder, then confronting him alone was dangerous, potentially fatal. Raymond's words echoed in my mind. He's closer than you think. Gideon had been right there the entire time, watching as I investigated Byron's disappearance, listening to my reports, guiding the investigation. Had he been trying to protect himself, to make sure I didn't dig too deep? I thought back over the past week, replaying every conversation I'd had with Gideon, every piece of advice he'd given me. He'd seemed genuinely concerned about the case, genuinely invested in finding out what happened to Byron. But now, looking at it through a different lens, I could see other possibilities. He'd been the one to suggest I focus on the accident angle at first, to treat Byron's disappearance as a simple case of someone getting lost in the swamp. He'd been the one to discourage me from looking into Byron's past too deeply. And when I'd found the connection to Marcus, Gideon had seemed surprised, almost uncomfortable, before quickly covering it with professional concern. As the sun began to rise, casting pale light through my windows, I made my decision. I would confront Gideon, but I would do it carefully, in a public place where there would be witnesses. I would wear a wire, record everything he said, and make sure Kincaid knew where I was and what I was doing. If Gideon was innocent, he'd be able to explain the receipt and we'd move on. But if he was guilty, if he even hesitated or tried to deflect, I'd have enough to bring him in for questioning. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best I could come up with on 3 hours of sleep and a head full of anger and confusion. I called Kincaid at 7 a.m. and told him I needed to see him immediately before shift change. We met in the parking lot of a convenience store about halfway between our houses, and I showed him the receipt. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Shock, disbelief, and then a slow, creeping horror as he realized what it meant. He wanted to bring Gideon in right away, get a warrant and search his house, but I convinced him to let me try my way first. I told him about my plan to wear a wire and meet Gideon in a public place, and after a long argument he agreed. But he insisted on being nearby with a tactical team, ready to move in if things went south. We went back to the station and I got wired up. a small digital recorder tucked into my belt and a microphone clipped inside my shirt. Kincaid tested it twice to make sure it was working, then gave me a quick rundown of what to say and how to get Gideon talking. The key was to be direct but not accusatory, to present the evidence as if I was confused and looking for his help rather than confronting him as a suspect. It felt dishonest, manipulative, but I reminded myself that this was about finding justice for Marcus, and if that meant playing games with a man I'd once respected, so be it. I found Gideon in his office, going through paperwork and sipping coffee from a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Chief." He looked up when I knocked and smiled, waving me in. He asked how I was holding up after the shooting, said he'd been worried about me, and offered me a seat. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I told him I was doing okay, that I'd spent the last few days resting and thinking about the case. Then I told him about the boat, about the waterproof box and the papers we'd found inside. Gideon's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, just for a moment. Concern, maybe, or calculation. He asked what kind of papers, and I told him they were financial records from the 90s, receipts and transaction slips. I pulled out the photocopy of the receipt with his signature and slid it across the desk. I said, "Chief, I need you to help me understand something. This receipt has your name on it, and it's dated 2 days before my brother died. Can you tell me what this was for?" Gideon picked up the paper and studied it, his face carefully neutral. He was quiet for a long time, so long that I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he set the receipt down and looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. It wasn't surprise or confusion. It was resignation. The look of a man who'd been carrying a heavy secret for too long and was almost relieved to finally be confronted with it. He said, "Talon, you have to understand. It was a different time back then. Things were complicated." I asked him what he meant, keeping my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. Gideon leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach, and then he started talking. He told me that in the mid-90s he'd been a sergeant with the tribal police, ambitious and eager to move up the ranks. But there was a problem. The department was under investigation by the federal government for corruption, specifically for turning a blind eye to illegal gambling operations being run on the reservation by outside interests. Gideon said he'd gotten involved, not in a major way, but enough that if the investigation went forward, his career would be over. Marcus, he said, had found out. My brother had been working as a fishing guide at the time, and he'd seen things, boats coming and going at odd hours. Men in expensive suits meeting with tribal council members in secret. Marcus had started asking questions, and he'd confided in Gideon, thinking he could trust him. But instead of helping Marcus, Gideon had panicked. He'd gone to the people running the gambling operation and told them there was a problem, someone who might expose everything. They'd told him to handle it, and they'd offered him money to make sure Marcus stayed quiet. That's what the $5,000 was for. That's what Gideon had paid Byron Redfeather and Curtis Longtree to do. I felt like I was going to be sick. I asked Gideon if he'd known they were going to kill Marcus, if that was part of the plan. He shook his head quickly, insisting that he'd only told them to scare him, to convince him to stop asking questions. But Byron had taken it further, had gotten into a fight with Marcus on the boat, and things had escalated. When Byron called Gideon afterward and told him what had happened, Gideon had helped cover it up, coached Byron and Curtis on what to say to the police, made sure the case was ruled an accident. He thought that was the end of it, that he could move on and put it behind him. But it wasn't the end. The guilt had followed him for 27 years, and when Byron had called him 2 months ago, terrified and rambling about seeing Raymond Longtree, Gideon had known the past was catching up. He'd tried to warn Byron to leave town, to disappear before Raymond found him, but Byron had refused. And when Byron turned up dead, Gideon had realized that Raymond wasn't going to stop until everyone involved was held accountable, including him. So he'd done what he'd always done. He'd tried to control the situation, to guide the investigation in a direction that would protect himself. I asked him if he'd known I would be the one investigating Byron's disappearance. Gideon nodded slowly and said, "I requested you specifically. I thought if anyone could handle it quietly, it would be you. But I underestimated how deep you'd dig. I underestimated how much you needed to know the truth about your brother." I felt a surge of anger so intense I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from lunging across the desk. This man, this person I'd looked up to and trusted, had not only orchestrated my brother's murder, but had then used me to try to cover his tracks one more time. I stood up and told Gideon he was under arrest. I started reading him his rights, but he held up a hand to stop me. He said, "Talon, wait. Before you do this, you need to know something else. The gambling operation, the people I was working with, they're still here. They're still operating. And they're more powerful now than they were in the 90s. If you bring me in, if you expose what happened, you're going to make a lot of very dangerous people very angry. They'll come after you, after your family. Is that really what you want?" I told him I didn't care. I told him that justice for Marcus was worth whatever consequences came with it. Gideon's expression hardened, and he said, "You're making a mistake." But before he could say anything else, the door to his office burst open and Kincaid rushed in with 2 uniformed officers. They'd been listening to the entire conversation through the wire, and they'd heard enough. Gideon didn't resist as they cuffed him and led him out of the office. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and contempt, and said, "You have no idea what you've started." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Gideon was processed and booked, his house and office searched, and his bank records subpoenaed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Not just the receipt from 1998, but years of financial records showing payments from offshore accounts linked to organized crime. The federal investigation that had been closed decades ago was reopened, and agents from the FBI descended on the reservation to take over the case. I gave my statement, handed over the recording from the wire, and then stepped back as the machinery of justice ground into motion. But even as Gideon was being arraigned and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and racketeering, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Gideon's warning kept playing in my head. "You have no idea what you've started." What did that mean? Who were these people he'd been working with? And what would they do now that their connection to the tribal police had been exposed? I tried to talk to Kincaid about it, but he told me to let the feds handle it, that my part in this was over. I took a week of administrative leave, partly to recover from everything that had happened, and partly because the department wanted me out of the way while they sorted through the fallout from Gideon's arrest. I spent most of that week at my mother's house, helping her process the news about Marcus, and trying to come to terms with what I'd learned. She was devastated, but also strangely relieved, like she'd finally been given permission to grieve properly after 27 years of not knowing the truth. We buried Marcus's bones in the tribal cemetery, a small, quiet ceremony attended by a few family members and friends. It should have felt like closure, but it didn't. It felt like the opening of a wound. On the 8th day of my leave, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was distorted, run through some kind of electronic filter, and it said, "Officer Osceola, we need to talk." I asked who it was, but the voice ignored my question and continued. "You did a brave thing, bringing down Gideon Greybird. But bravery and stupidity often look the same, and in this case, you crossed a line you shouldn't have. We wanted you to know that we're watching you. We're watching your mother. We're watching everyone you care about. And if you continue to dig into things that don't concern you, there will be consequences. I tried to trace the call, but it came from a burner phone that was turned off immediately after we hung up. I reported it to Kincaid and the FBI, but they told me it was likely just an empty threat, someone trying to scare me into silence. They assigned a patrol car to drive by my mother's house a few times a day and told me to be careful. But that was it. No protective detail, no safe house, nothing. I realized then that Gideon had been right. The people he'd been working with were still out there, and they were more powerful than anyone wanted to admit. I went back to work after my leave ended, but things were different. The other officers treated me with a mixture of respect and wariness, like I was a hero and a liability all at once. A new chief was appointed, a woman from outside the reservation who'd been brought in to clean up the department and restore public trust. She was professional and competent, but she wasn't Gideon, and I found myself missing the familiarity of his presence even though I knew he was a murderer. It was a strange, uncomfortable feeling, mourning the loss of something that had never been real in the first place. The case against Gideon moved forward slowly. His lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence and delay the trial. The federal investigation into the gambling operation yielded a few low-level arrests, but nothing major, and I got the sense that the higher-ups were being protected by people with enough money and influence to make problems disappear. I testified before a grand jury, recounting everything I'd learned and everything Gideon had confessed to, but even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in some of the jurors' eyes. Gideon's lawyers had done a good job painting him as a scapegoat, a small-town cop being railroaded by ambitious federal prosecutors. 3 months after Gideon's arrest, I received another call from the distorted voice. This time, the message was shorter and more direct. They said, "We gave you a chance to walk away, and you didn't take it. Now you'll live with the consequences." The call ended, and I stood there in my kitchen, staring at my phone and feeling a cold dread settle over me. I didn't know what form those consequences would take, but I knew they were coming. The next morning I woke up to find that my mother's house had been broken into during the night. Nothing was stolen, but the place had been ransacked, furniture overturned and drawers emptied. And on the kitchen table, arranged in a circle, just like the bones had been at May Hummingbird's house, were 5 bullets. No note this time, but the message was clear. They could get to her whenever they wanted, and if I didn't stop pushing, they would. I moved my mother out of her house that day, took her to stay with relatives in another state, and told her not to come back until I said it was safe. She didn't argue, just hugged me tight and told me to be careful. I hired a private security company to watch my own house and started varying my routes to and from work, never taking the same road twice in a row. I was living like a fugitive, constantly looking over my shoulder, and the stress was eating away at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on my job. Kincaid noticed and pulled me aside, told me I needed to talk to someone, maybe a therapist or a counselor. I said I was fine, but we both knew that was a lie. 6 months after everything started, Gideon's trial finally began. I testified on the 3rd day, spending hours on the stand recounting the investigation and Gideon's confession. His lawyers tried to discredit me, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence or misunderstood what Gideon had said, but the recording from the wire spoke for itself. When I stepped down, I thought I'd feel relief, but instead I just felt empty. The trial dragged on for another month, and then the jury came back with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Gideon Graybird was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I thought that would be the end of it, that the people who'd been threatening me would disappear now that Gideon was behind bars. But the calls continued, and the surveillance outside my house picked up shadowy figures lurking in the trees at night. I reported everything to the FBI, but they seemed more interested in closing the case than protecting me. I realized I was on my own, that whatever protection I'd thought I'd have from bringing Gideon to justice was an illusion. 1 year after Byron Redfeather vanished from the Cypress dock, I sat in my office and wrote a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, just a record of everything I knew about the gambling operation and the people Gideon had been connected to. I included names, dates, financial records, everything I'd managed to gather in the months since his arrest. I made 3 copies, sealed them in envelopes, and gave one to Kincaid, one to my lawyer, and one to a journalist I trusted. I told them that if anything happened to me, they should publish everything. It was my insurance policy, my way of making sure that even if they silenced me, the truth would come out. I still work for the Miccosukee Tribal Police. I still patrol the same roads and respond to the same calls. But I don't sleep well anymore, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every shadow could be a threat, every stranger a potential danger. I think about Marcus sometimes, about the life he might have lived if Gideon hadn't decided he was a problem that needed to be eliminated. I think about Byron and May and Raymond, all dead because of secrets and lies that should have been exposed decades ago. And I think about Gideon's warning, that I had no idea what I'd started. He was right. I thought I was solving a murder, bringing a killer to justice. But what I really did was peel back a layer of rot to reveal something much deeper and more widespread. The gambling operation is still running, the people behind it still free and powerful. And every day I wake up wondering if today will be the day they decide I've become too much of a liability. I don't regret what I did. Marcus deserved justice, and Gideon deserved to pay for what he'd done. But justice came at a price, and I'm still paying it. I look over my shoulder constantly, keep my weapon close, and live with the knowledge that the swamp isn't the only thing in the Everglades that swallows people whole. Sometimes the monsters wear badges and sit in corner offices, and sometimes bringing them down doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you a target. The file on Byron Redfeather's death is officially closed. The file on Marcus Osceola's death has been updated to reflect the truth. But there are other files, thicker ones filled with names and connections that lead into darkness I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully illuminate. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the law, the people Gideon worked for are watching and waiting. They know I'm the one who brought their operation into the light, and they know that as long as I'm alive, there's a chance I'll do it again. So I keep working, keep patrolling, keep living my life as normally as I can. But I also keep that letter ready, keep my insurance policy up to date, and remind myself that the truth is worth fighting for even when the cost is everything you have. The Everglades might not have claimed my brother's body for 27 years, but it eventually gave him back. And in doing so, it revealed a darkness that runs deeper than any swamp, a corruption that touches everything it reaches. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if I'll survive long enough to see the people behind the gambling operation brought to justice, or if they'll get to me first. But I do know that I made a choice the day I confronted Gideon in his office, and I can't unmake it now. All I can do is keep moving forward, keep searching for truth in the shadows, and hope that when the end comes, whether it's tomorrow or 30 years from now, I'll have done enough to make Marcus proud. The swamp keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you're willing to dig deep enough and risk everything, it gives them back. The question is whether you can live with what you find. The Weather Service had been warning about the storm for 3 days, but nobody on the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation really took it seriously until the winds started tearing shingles off roofs, and the rain came down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of your face. I'd been with the Seminole Tribal Police for 5 years, and I'd worked through plenty of Florida storms. but this one felt different from the moment I rolled out of bed that morning. The air had a weight to it, a pressure that made your ears pop and your head ache, and the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and black and swollen with malice. My name is Rhett Tallman, and I was supposed to be off duty that Thursday. Supposed to be at home, boarding up windows and moving my truck to higher ground like everyone else with any sense. But dispatch called me at 6 a.m. and said they needed all hands on deck, that the storm was tracking worse than predicted, and they were expecting flooding in the low-lying areas. I got dressed, checked my gear, and headed to the station. The drive was already treacherous, palm fronds and debris scattered across the roads, and the wind buffeting my patrol truck so hard I had to grip the wheel with both hands to keep from veering into the ditch. The station was chaos when I arrived. Officers were coming and going, taking calls about downed power lines and flooded streets, and the dispatcher, a woman named Hazel Nightwind, who'd been working the desk for 20 years, was fielding emergency calls as fast as they came in. She looked exhausted already, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes rimmed with dark circles. When she saw me, she waved me over and shoved a slip of paper across the counter. She said, "Tallman, I need you to do a welfare check out at the old church camp on County Road 846. We got a call from a woman saying she and some others are stranded there, and they need assistance. The camp's been abandoned for years, so I don't know what they were doing out there, but they're stuck now." I took the paper and looked at the address. The church camp was about 15 miles northwest of the station, deep in the swamp where the roads turned to dirt and the cell signal disappeared. It wasn't a place I'd want to be in good weather, let alone in the middle of a tropical storm. I asked Hazel if there was any more information, how many people were stranded, what kind of assistance they needed, but she just shook her head. The call cut out before she could get details, she said, and when she tried calling back, there was no answer. All we know is someone's out there and they're in trouble. I grabbed a go bag from the supply room, extra batteries for my flashlight, a first aid kit, some bottled water, and a poncho, and headed back out into the storm. The rain had intensified in just the 20 minutes I'd been inside, coming down in sheets that turned the world into a gray, watery blur. My truck's wipers were working overtime, and even at their fastest setting, they could barely keep up. The roads were already starting to flood, water pooling in the low spots and creeping up over the asphalt. I drove slowly, watching for debris and downed branches, and tried not to think about what would happen if I got stuck out here. County Road 846 was exactly as bad as I'd expected. A narrow two-lane that cut through dense forest and swampland. The pavement gave way to gravel after about 5 miles, and the gravel gave way to mud after another 3. My truck slipped and slid, the tires fighting for traction, and more than once I thought I was going to end up nose down in a ditch. But I kept going, following the directions Hazel had given me, until I finally saw the sign for the church camp. It was a weathered wooden post, leaning at a 45-degree angle, the words Camp Resurrection barely visible beneath layers of mold and peeling paint. The entrance to the camp was blocked by a rusted chain-link gate that hung open on broken hinges. I eased the truck through and continued down a dirt road that was more puddle than road at this point. The trees pressed in close on either sides, their branches scraping against the truck's roof and windows, and the rain drummed on the metal so loud I could barely hear myself think. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, the road opened up into a clearing, and I got my first look at Camp Resurrection. It was exactly the kind of place that makes your skin crawl even in broad daylight. There were about a dozen buildings scattered around the clearing, all of them in various states of collapse. The main lodge was a 2-story structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch, and surrounding it were smaller cabins, a dining hall with half its roof missing, and what looked like an old chapel with a crooked steeple. Everything was covered in vines and Spanish moss, and the whole place had that abandoned, forgotten quality that makes you feel like you're trespassing even when you're not. I parked the truck near the main lodge and sat there for a moment, gathering my courage. The storm was hammering down now, the wind howling through the trees and rattling the truck. I could see movement inside one of the cabins, shadows behind a broken window, and I knew that's where I'd find whoever had called for help. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio, pulled the poncho over my head, and stepped out into the deluge. The rain hit me like a physical force, cold and stinging, and within seconds I was soaked through despite the poncho. I made my way across the clearing, my boots sinking into the mud with every step, and climbed the rickety steps to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside, low and urgent. I knocked and called out, identifying myself as Seminole Tribal Police and saying I was here to help. The voices stopped abruptly, and there was a long pause before the door swung open. Standing there was a woman in her 30s, pale and shivering, her clothes soaked, and her hair plastered to her face. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and said, "Thank God you're here. Please, you have to help us." Her name was Iris Moonwalker, and she told me she'd been part of a group of 5 people who'd come to the camp yesterday for what was supposed to be a spiritual retreat organized by a local pastor. They'd planned to spend 3 days out here, disconnected from the world, focused on prayer and reflection. But the storm had rolled in faster and harder than anyone expected, and by the time they realized they needed to leave, the roads were already flooded and impassable. They'd been stuck here for almost 24 hours, and things had gone from bad to worse in the last few hours. I asked her what she meant by worse, and she hesitated, glancing back into the darkened cabin. She said, "2 of us are missing. They went out this morning to try to find a way to the main road, and they never came back. We've been calling for them, searching, but we can't find them anywhere. And then there's the other problem." She paused again, and I could see genuine fear in her eyes. "Pastor Stormcrow, he's not himself. He's been acting strange, saying things that don't make sense. We're scared of him." I stepped inside the cabin, shaking the water off my poncho, and got my first look at the situation. There were 3 other people huddled in the corner of the room, 2 women and a man, all of them looking cold, wet, and terrified. And sitting by himself on the far side of the room, illuminated by the flickering light of a battery-powered lantern, was a man I assumed was Pastor Elias Stormcrow. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with long silver hair and a gaunt face. He was rocking back and forth slightly, his hands clasped together, and he was muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. I introduced myself to the group and asked them to give me a rundown of what had happened. The man, who said his name was David, told me that they'd arrived at the camp Tuesday afternoon. Pastor Stormcrow had led them in prayers and discussions, and everything had seemed normal at first. But as the storm rolled in and they realized they were trapped, the pastor had started acting erratically. He'd begun talking about signs and omens, about how the storm was a test sent by God, about how they needed to prove their faith. And then this morning, when 2 members of the group, a married couple named Tom and Linda, had announced they were going to try to walk to the main road to get help, Pastor Stormcrow had tried to stop them. He'd said they were being tested, and that leaving would be a failure of faith. But Tom and Linda had gone anyway, and they hadn't come back. I looked at Pastor Stormcrow, who was still muttering and rocking, and felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. I asked the group if the pastor had been violent or threatening, and they all shook their heads. Iris said he hasn't hurt anyone, but the things he's saying, they're not right. He keeps talking about sacrifices and purification, about how we're being cleansed, and he won't let us leave. When we tried to go this morning, he blocked the door and said we had to stay until the storm passed. I walked over to Pastor Stormcrow and crouched down to his level, I said, "Pastor, my name is Officer Tallman. I'm here to help. Can you tell me what's going on?" He stopped muttering and looked up at me, and I saw that his eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, like he hadn't slept in days. He smiled, a strange, unsettling expression, and said, "Officer, you don't understand. This isn't a storm, it's a reckoning. We're being judged, all of us, and only those who are pure will survive." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and went back to muttering. I stood up and pulled Iris aside. I told her that I needed to find Tom and Linda, and that I wanted her and the others to come with me to my truck. We'd drive out of here together, and I'd come back with a larger team to search for the missing couple. But Iris shook her head. She said, "The roads are too flooded. We tried to leave an hour ago, and we couldn't get more than 100 yards before the water was up to our waists. There's no way out until the storm passes." I looked out the window at the torrential rain and realized she was right. We were stuck here, at least for the next few hours, and somewhere out in this mess were 2 missing people. I made a decision. I told Iris and the others to stay in the cabin, keep the door locked, and don't let Pastor Stormcrow out of their sight. Then I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out into the storm. I needed to find Tom and Linda, and I needed to do it before the situation got any worse. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I stepped off the cabin's porch, and the rain was so thick it was like walking through a waterfall. I swept my flashlight beam across the clearing, looking for any sign of the missing couple, and that's when I saw it. There was a trail leading away from the clearing, a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. It was barely visible through the rain, but I could make out footprints in the mud, 2 sets leading away from the camp. I followed them, calling out Tom and Linda's names, but the wind tore the words from my mouth and scattered them into the storm. The trail wound through the forest, ducking under low-hanging branches and skirting around pools of standing water. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, following the footprints, and tried not to think about how easy it would be to get lost out here. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came to a place where the trail split. The footprints went to the left, but there was something on the right that caught my attention. A piece of fabric, bright red, caught on a branch about 4 feet off the ground. I pulled it free and examined it. It was a strip torn from a jacket or a shirt, and it was fresh, not weathered or faded. Someone had been here recently, and they'd either snagged their clothing on the branch or left it as a marker. I pocketed the fabric and continued following the footprints to the left. The trail led me to a small ravine, maybe 15 feet deep and 20 feet across, with a stream running through the bottom. Normally, it would have been a trickle, but with the storm, it had swollen into a raging torrent of brown water and debris. And there, caught in the branches of a fallen tree halfway down the ravine, was a body. I scrambled down the muddy slope, nearly losing my footing several times, and waded into the water. It was chest deep and moving fast, trying to pull me downstream, but I managed to grab hold of the tree and pull myself closer to the body. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a blue windbreaker. His face was turned away from me, half submerged in the water, and I reached out to turn him over. When I did, I saw that it was Tom, one of the missing members of the group. His eyes were open and empty, and there was a deep gash across his forehead, probably from hitting his head on a rock when he fell into the ravine. I checked for a pulse, but I already knew there wouldn't be one. Tom was dead, drowned in the flooded ravine while trying to escape the camp. I pulled his body out of the water and dragged it up onto the bank, then radioed dispatch to report the death. Hazel's voice came back crackling with static, asking if I needed backup. I told her I did, but that the roads were impassable, and it would have to wait until the storm cleared. She acknowledged and told me to secure the scene as best I could. I covered Tom's body with my poncho and marked the location with my flashlight, then turned my attention to finding Linda. If Tom had made it this far, There was a chance Linda had too. I searched the area around the ravine, calling Linda's name and sweeping my flashlight through the trees. The storm was starting to ease slightly, the rain letting up just enough that I could see more than a few feet ahead. But there was no sign of Linda, no footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was like she'd vanished. I spent another 20 minutes searching before I finally accepted that I wasn't going to find her out here in the dark and the rain. I needed to get back to the cabin, make sure the others were safe, and wait for the storm to pass. The walk back to the camp felt longer than the walk out. Maybe because I was exhausted and soaked to the bone. Or maybe because I couldn't stop thinking about Tom's body lying in that ravine. When I finally emerged from the trees and saw the clearing, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief turned to alarm when I saw that the door to the cabin was standing wide open, and there was no light coming from inside. I broke into a run, splashing through puddles and nearly tripping over a downed branch, and burst through the door. The cabin was empty. Iris, David, and the two women were gone, and so was Pastor Stormcrow. The lantern was still burning, casting its flickering light across the abandoned room, and there were signs of a struggle. One of the chairs was overturned, and there were muddy footprints leading from the cabin door to the back of the room. I followed the footprints and found a window that had been forced open from the outside. Someone, or something, had broken into the cabin while I was gone and taken the group. I keyed my radio and called dispatch, my voice tight with urgency. "Hazel, I've got a situation here. The group I was sent to check on, they're gone, all of them, and one of the missing persons is dead, drowned in a ravine. I need backup out here as soon as possible." Hazel's response was immediate but not reassuring. She said, "Tallman, the storm's too bad. We can't get anyone out there until it clears, probably not until tomorrow morning. You're on your own for now, do what you can to find them, but don't take any unnecessary risks." I stood there in the empty cabin, listening to the rain hammer on the roof and the wind howl through the broken window, and felt a cold knot of fear settle in my stomach. Somewhere out in this storm were 4 terrified people and a possibly unstable pastor, and I had no backup, no reinforcements, no way to call for help. I was alone in an abandoned church camp in the middle of a swamp, with a dead body in a ravine and a group of missing people who might already be in serious danger. And the worst part was I had no idea where to even start looking. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and made a plan. First, I'd search the other buildings in the camp. If Pastor Stormcrow had taken the group somewhere, it was likely they were still on the property. Second, I'd look for any signs of where they might have gone. Tracks in the mud, disturbed vegetation, anything that could point me in the right direction. And third, I'd trust my instincts. I'd been a cop long enough to know that sometimes you have to go with your gut, even when logic tells you you're wasting your time. I left the cabin and started with the building closest to it, a small storage shed with a corrugated metal roof. The door was locked, but I could see through a crack in the wall that it was empty except for some old tools and rotting lumber. I moved on to the next building, the dining hall with the half-missing roof. The place was a wreck, tables and chairs scattered everywhere and the floor covered in a layer of leaves and debris. But in the corner, tucked behind an overturned bench, I found something that made my pulse quicken. It was a shoe, a woman's sneaker, white with pink trim, and sitting next to it, carefully placed on top of an old Bible, was a handwritten note. I picked up the note with shaking hands and held my flashlight close to read it. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, written in what looked like charcoal or pencil. It said, "The chapel. He took us to the chapel. He says we have to atone. Please help us." It was signed with the initial I, which I assumed was Iris. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, then grabbed the shoe. The chapel was the building with the crooked steeple, the one I'd seen when I first arrived. It was on the far side of the clearing, past the main lodge, and it looked like it was barely standing. I left the dining hall and headed for the chapel, my hand resting on my weapon. The storm was picking up again. The brief lull over and the rain came down even harder than before. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the camp in stark white bursts that made the shadows seem even darker. Thunder followed seconds later, so loud it felt like the ground was shaking. I reached the chapel steps and paused, listening. From inside, I could hear voices, multiple people talking at once, and above it all, the sound of Pastor Stormcrow preaching. His words were muffled by the storm and the thick wooden walls of the chapel, but I could make out enough to know he was in the middle of some kind of sermon. He was talking about sin and redemption, about sacrifice and cleansing, and his voice had taken on a fevered, ecstatic quality that sent chills down my spine. I tried the chapel door and found it locked from the inside. I pounded on it with my fist and called out, identifying myself as police and demanding they open up. The preaching stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. Then I heard footsteps approaching the door, slow and deliberate. The door opened just a crack, and Pastor Stormcrow's face appeared in the gap. He looked even worse than before. His eyes wild and his face streaked with mud or ash. He smiled at me and said, "Officer Tallman, you've come to join us for the ceremony." How wonderful. I told him there wasn't going to be any ceremony, that he needed to let the others go and come with me peacefully. But he just shook his head and said, "You don't understand. We're being purified. The storm is God's will, and we must submit to it. Only through sacrifice can we be saved." I tried to push the door open, but he slammed it shut, and I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor to barricade it. I stepped back and considered my options. I could try to force the door, but that would take time and make a lot of noise, and I didn't know what Pastor Stormcrow might do to the others if I provoked him. Or I could try to find another way in, a window or a back door, and take him by surprise. I decided on the latter. I circled around the chapel, testing windows and looking for any opening, and finally found a broken pane on the side of the building. It was small, but I thought I could squeeze through if I was careful. I smashed out the remaining glass with the butt of my flashlight, wrapped my hand in my shirt to protect it from the shards, and pulled myself up and through the window. I landed on the floor inside the chapel with a thud that was mercifully covered by a crack of thunder. I crouched there in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust, and took stock of my surroundings. The chapel was small, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with rows of moldering pews and a raised altar at the front. And there, gathered around the altar, were Iris, David, and the two other women, all on their knees with their hands clasped in prayer. Pastor Stormcrow was standing over them, holding something in his hand that glinted in the candlelight. It was a knife. I drew my weapon slowly, keeping it low and pointed at the floor, and moved along the wall of the chapel, using the shadows and the sound of the storm to mask my approach. Pastor Elias Stormcrow was still standing at the altar, the knife held loosely in his right hand, and he was speaking in that same fevered, ecstatic tone I'd heard through the door. He was telling the group that they had been chosen, that the storm had brought them here for a reason, that their suffering would purify them and make them worthy of salvation. The four people kneeling before him, Iris Moonwalker, David, and the two women whose names I still didn't know, looked terrified, but also strangely compliant, like they'd been broken down by hours of this relentless preaching. I got within about 15 feet of the altar before Pastor Stormcrow noticed me. He stopped mid-sentence and turned, his wild eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then he smiled, that same unsettling expression I'd seen earlier, and raised the knife. He said, "Officer Tallman, you've interrupted the ceremony. That's very unfortunate." I told him to put the knife down, to step away from the people, and to get on his knees with his hands behind his head. My voice was steady, professional, the tone I'd used hundreds of times before when dealing with dangerous situations. But Pastor Stormcrow didn't comply. Instead, he laughed, a sound that was more unsettling than anything else he'd done. He said, "You think you're in control here, but you're not. None of us are. The storm controls us. God controls us. And I'm simply his instrument." He gestured with the knife toward the group kneeling in front of him. "These people came here seeking answers, seeking redemption, and I'm going to give it to them. Through pain, through sacrifice, through blood. That's the only way to be truly clean." I could see Iris trembling, tears streaming down her face, and I knew I was running out of time. If I didn't act now, Pastor Stormcrow was going to hurt someone. Maybe all of them. I took a step closer, my weapon now raised and aimed at his center mass. I told him one more time to drop the knife, and I added that if he didn't comply, I would shoot. I didn't want to do it. Didn't want to take a life if I could avoid it. But I also wasn't going to let him stab innocent people while I stood there and watched. Pastor Stormcrow's smile faded, and his expression turned dark and angry. He said, "You would dare to stop God's work? You would interfere with divine justice? Then you're no better than the sinners kneeling here. You're all the same, all corrupt, all in need of cleansing." He moved suddenly, faster than I expected for a man his age, and lunged toward Iris with the knife raised. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to second-guess myself. I squeezed the trigger twice, the shots echoing through the small chapel like cannon fire. Both rounds hit Pastor Stormcrow in the chest, and he stumbled backward, the knife falling from his hand and clattering across the wooden floor. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then looked up at me with an expression of genuine surprise, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then he collapsed, falling forward onto the altar steps. For a moment, nobody moved. The 4 people who'd been kneeling just stared at the pastor's body, their faces frozen in shock. Then Iris let out a sob and scrambled away from the altar, and that broke the spell. David and the 2 women got to their feet and backed toward the wall, and I moved forward to check on Pastor Stormcrow. I kicked the knife away from his body, then knelt down and felt for a pulse. There was nothing. He was dead. I'd killed him. I stood up and looked at the group, all of them staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I said, "Are any of you hurt? Did he cut anyone before I got here?" They all shook their heads. Iris said, her voice barely above a whisper, "He was about to. He said we had to be marked, that blood was the only way to wash away our sins. You saved us. I didn't feel like I'd saved anyone. I felt like I'd just made a bad situation worse. I'd come here to do a welfare check, to help some people stranded in a storm, and now there were 2 dead bodies, one in a ravine and one on the floor of an abandoned chapel, and I was alone with 4 traumatized civilians in the middle of a tropical storm with no backup and no way out." I radioed dispatch and reported the shooting, my voice mechanical as I gave Hazel Nightwind the details. Officer involved shooting, 1 suspect deceased, no officers injured, 4 civilians safe. Hazel's response was calm but urgent. She said, "Tallman, you need to secure the scene and wait for the investigative team. They're mobilizing now, but it's going to be several hours before they can get to you. Can you hold out until then?" I told her I could, but I wasn't sure if that was true. The storm was still raging outside, the chapel was barely standing, and I had 4 people who were on the verge of complete mental collapse. I turned to the group and told them we needed to move to a more secure location. The chapel was too exposed, and I didn't trust the structure to hold up if the storm got any worse. I suggested we go back to the main lodge, which looked like the sturdiest building in the camp. They agreed without argument, too shell-shocked to do anything but follow orders. I covered Pastor Stormcrow's body with a tarp I found in the corner of the chapel, more out of respect than necessity, and then led the group out into the storm. The rain had somehow gotten even worse, if that was possible. It came down in solid sheets, turning the clearing into a shallow lake, and the wind was strong enough to nearly knock us off our feet. We moved as a group, staying close together and helping each other when someone stumbled. It took us 10 minutes to cross the clearing to the main lodge, a distance that should have taken 2, and by the time we reached the porch, we were all soaked to the bone and shivering with cold. The main lodge's front door was unlocked, and I pushed it open cautiously, my flashlight sweeping the interior. The place was in rough shape, with holes in the ceiling where rain was pouring through and puddles forming on the warped wooden floor. But it was still better than being outside, and there were enough intact rooms that we could find a place to wait out the storm. I led the group to what looked like an old common room, a large space with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of furniture that were still relatively dry. I told them to sit down and try to warm up while I did a quick sweep of the building to make sure we were alone. The lodge had maybe 20 rooms spread across 2 floors, most of them small bedrooms or offices. I checked each one methodically, looking for any signs of recent occupation or anything that might be useful. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found a box of emergency supplies, blankets, flashlights with working batteries, and some canned food. I grabbed everything and brought it back down to the common room, distributing the blankets to the group. They wrapped themselves up and huddled together near the fireplace, and I used some old newspapers and broken furniture to start a fire. It took a few tries, but eventually, the flames caught and spread, filling the room with warmth and flickering light. With the immediate needs taken care of, I turned my attention to the group. I needed to understand what had happened here, why Pastor Stormcrow had gone from leading a spiritual retreat to threatening people with a knife. I sat down across from them and said, "I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning, from when you first arrived at the camp." Iris Moonwalker, who seemed to have recovered some of her composure, spoke first. She said they'd been part of Pastor Stormcrow's congregation for the past year, a small group that met weekly in a rented space in Fort Myers. The pastor had always been intense, passionate about his faith, but he'd never seemed dangerous. About 2 months ago, Pastor Stormcrow had started talking about a special retreat, a chance for his most devoted followers to deepen their faith through isolation and contemplation. He'd found this abandoned camp and convinced the group that spending time here, away from the distractions of modern life, would bring them closer to God. 5 of them had agreed to come: Iris, David, the 2 women named Sarah and Michelle, and the couple Tom and Linda. They'd arrived Tuesday afternoon, just as the weather started to turn, and at first, everything had seemed fine. The pastor led them in prayers and Bible study, and they'd spent the evening sharing their struggles and trying to support each other. But that night, the storm had intensified, and the power had gone out. They'd lit candles and tried to stay calm, but Pastor Stormcrow had started acting strangely. He'd told them that the storm was a sign, that God was testing them, and that they needed to prove their worthiness. He'd insisted they stay at the camp, even when the roads started flooding and it became clear they were trapped. And then, Wednesday morning, when Tom and Linda had decided to try to walk out and get help, the pastor had completely lost control. He'd blocked the door, screaming about faithlessness and betrayal, and he'd threatened Tom physically. They'd managed to push past him and run into the storm, but that was the last anyone had seen of them. I asked David to continue the story. He said that after Tom and Linda left, Pastor Stormcrow had become even more erratic. He'd spent hours pacing the cabin, muttering to himself and reading passages from the Bible. He'd told the remaining group that they needed to atone for Tom and Linda's sin, that their departure had brought judgment upon all of them. When I'd arrived and left to search for the missing couple, the pastor had waited until I was out of sight, then forced the group to come with him to the chapel. He'd barricaded the door and started what he called a purification ceremony, lighting candles and making them kneel before the altar. Sarah, one of the women who hadn't spoken until now, added that Pastor Stormcrow had talked about blood sacrifice, about how the Old Testament was full of examples of people offering their lives to God. He'd said that one of them would need to volunteer, to offer themselves as a sacrifice to cleanse the group and appease God's wrath. When no one volunteered, he'd said he would choose for them, and that's when he'd pulled out the knife. Sarah's voice broke as she finished, and Michelle put an arm around her shoulders. I sat back and processed everything they'd told me. Pastor Elias Stormcrow had clearly suffered some kind of psychotic break, triggered by the stress of the storm and the isolation of the camp. Maybe he'd had underlying mental health issues that had been kept in check by medication or routine, and being out here had pushed him over the edge. Or maybe there was something about this place, something about Camp Resurrection, that had affected him. I made a mental note to look into the camp's history when I got back to the station, to see if there had been any previous incidents or complaints. For now, though, my priority was keeping these 4 people safe until help arrived. I checked my watch and saw it was almost midnight. We'd been at the camp for over 6 hours, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I told the group to try to get some rest, that I'd keep watch and wake them if anything changed. They nodded and settled down near the fire, wrapping themselves in blankets and closing their eyes. I doubted any of them would actually sleep, but at least they could rest. I moved to a window and looked out at the storm. The rain was still coming down hard, and the wind was shaking the trees so violently it looked like they might uproot. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the camp in brief, stark bursts, and in those moments I could see the chapel in the distance, its crooked steeple leaning at an even more precarious angle. I thought about Pastor Stormcrow's body lying inside, and I thought about Tom's body in the ravine, and I thought about Linda, still missing somewhere in the swamp. I should have been searching for her, should have been out there combing the forest, but I knew that would be suicidal in these conditions. The best I could do was wait for the storm to pass and for backup to arrive, and then mount a proper search. But the waiting was eating at me, the not knowing, the feeling that I was failing in my duty to protect and serve. I'd been a cop for 5 years, and I'd seen my share of bad situations, but this was different. This felt personal, like the swamp itself was testing me, pushing me to see how much I could take before I broke. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise from upstairs. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the storm, but it was definitely there. A creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. I froze, my hand moving to my weapon, and listened. There it was again. Another creak, and then the sound of footsteps moving slowly across the floor above me. I looked at the group sleeping by the fire, confirming they were all still there, which meant someone else was in the building. I moved to the base of the stairs and called out, identifying myself and demanding that whoever was up there come down immediately. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then I heard a voice, faint and trembling. It said, "Help me. Please help me." It was a woman's voice, and I recognized it immediately. It was Linda, the missing woman from the couple who'd tried to walk out that morning. I climbed the stairs quickly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and found her in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. She was sitting on the floor in the corner, her clothes torn and muddy, her face scratched and bleeding. She looked up at me with hollow, exhausted eyes and said, "I got lost. I've been wandering out there for hours. I saw the light from the fire and found my way here. I crouched down next to her and checked her for injuries. Besides the scratches and what looked like the early stages of hypothermia, she seemed okay." I asked her about Tom, and her face crumpled. She said they'd stayed together at first, trying to find the main road, but the storm had been too intense and they'd gotten turned around. They'd ended up at the ravine, and Tom had insisted they cross it. thinking the road was on the other side. He'd gone first, trying to wade through the water, but the current had been too strong. She'd watched him get swept away, watched him hit his head on a rock and disappear under the water. She'd tried to go after him, but the water was too deep and too fast, and she'd barely made it back to shore. After that, she'd wandered through the forest for hours, terrified and alone, until she'd finally seen the lodge. I helped Linda to her feet and brought her downstairs, wrapping her in one of the blankets and sitting her by the fire. The others woke up when they heard us, and there was a brief, emotional reunion as they realized Linda was alive. I gave her some water and a piece of the canned food I'd found, and she ate mechanically, still in shock from everything that had happened. I updated dispatch on Linda's status, and Hazel told me the investigative team was hoping to reach us by dawn if the storm eased up. The next few hours passed slowly. I kept watch while the group dozed fitfully by the fire, and I tried to stay alert despite the exhaustion that was pulling at me. Every sound made me tense, every creak of the old building making me think someone or something was moving through the lodge. But nothing happened. The storm continued to rage outside, and we continued to wait. Around 5 a.m., the rain finally started to let up. It didn't stop completely, but it slowed to a steady drizzle, and the wind died down to a manageable level. I looked out the window and saw the first hints of dawn breaking through the clouds, a pale gray light that made the camp look even more desolate and abandoned than it had in the darkness. I radioed dispatch and asked for an update on the investigative team. Hazel said they were en route, ETA about 30 minutes, and that they'd bring a medical team to check on the civilians. I woke the group and told them help was on the way. They looked relieved but also exhausted, like they didn't quite believe it was really over. Linda asked me what would happen next, and I told her there would be statements to take, reports to file, and probably some counseling to help them process the trauma. I also told her that Tom's body would be recovered and that she'd be able to make arrangements for him. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, and I felt a pang of sympathy. She'd come here looking for spiritual renewal and instead lost her husband in the worst possible way. The investigative team arrived just after 6 a.m., a convoy of trucks and SUVs that pulled into the clearing like a small army. There were detectives, forensic techs, paramedics, and even a representative from the tribal council. I briefed the lead detective, a man named Marcus Silvercloud, who I'd worked with before, on everything that had happened. He listened without interrupting, taking notes, and when I finished, he said I'd done everything right. He told me to go back to the station, get cleaned up, and prepare for a formal debriefing later in the day. I nodded, grateful for the chance to leave this place behind. Before I left, I checked on the group one more time. The paramedics were examining them, treating minor injuries and assessing them for shock and hypothermia. Iris Moonwalker caught my eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." I nodded back, but I didn't feel like I deserved any thanks. 2 people were dead, and while I'd saved 4 others, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, should have prevented the whole situation from spiraling out of control. I climbed into my truck and started the drive back to the station. The roads were still flooded in places but passable, and I took it slow, not trusting my exhausted reflexes. As I drove, I thought about Pastor Elias Stormcrow and what had driven him to such madness. Had it been a mental break or something more? Had there been warning signs that his congregation had missed? Or had this been a sudden, inexplicable descent into violence? I made another mental note to pull his records, talk to people who knew him, and try to understand what had happened. Back at the station, I filed my initial report and submitted to a preliminary interview with Internal Affairs, standard procedure for any officer-involved shooting. They asked me to walk through the events leading up to the moment I pulled the trigger, and I did, trying to be as accurate and detailed as possible. They seemed satisfied that I'd acted in defense of others, and they told me I'd be placed on administrative leave while the investigation was completed. I expected that, and honestly, I welcomed it. I needed time to process everything that had happened. I went home, showered, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Pastor Stormcrow lunging at Iris with the knife, saw the look of surprise on his face when my bullets hit him. I gave up after an hour and made coffee instead, sitting at my kitchen table and staring out the window at the rain that was still falling. Lighter now, but persistent. My phone rang around noon. It was Marcus Silvercloud, the detective who'd taken over the case. He said they'd completed the initial investigation of the camp and wanted me to know what they'd found. I told him I was listening, and he said, "Tallman, we searched Pastor Stormcrow's belongings and we found something disturbing." He had a journal filled with entries going back about 2 months. The entries start normal, just reflections on his faith and his congregation. But about halfway through, they get dark. He starts talking about visions, about voices telling him he needs to purify his followers, that blood is the only way to cleanse sin. I asked Marcus if there was any indication of what triggered the change, and he said, "We're still going through it, but there's a reference to a book he found. He doesn't name it, but he says it opened his eyes to the truth, that modern religion has gone soft, and that the old ways, the ways of sacrifice and blood, are the only true path to God." We searched his car and found a book in the trunk, an old, leather-bound thing with no title. We're having it examined, but from what we can tell, it's some kind of religious text, possibly from a cult or fringe group. I felt a chill run through me. Pastor Stormcrow hadn't just snapped. He'd been influenced, maybe even radicalized, by something he'd read. And that raised a troubling question. Where had he gotten the book? And were there others out there reading the same material, getting the same dangerous ideas? I asked Marcus to keep me updated, and he promised he would. Then he said, "One more thing, Tallman. We found Linda's husband's body in the ravine just where you said it would be. We also found something else. There were markings carved into the trees near the ravine, symbols that match some of the drawings in Pastor Stormcrow's journal. It looks like he'd been out there before, maybe scouting locations or performing some kind of ritual." That information settled over me like a weight. This whole situation had been planned, at least to some degree. Pastor Stormcrow had brought his congregation to this specific place, to this abandoned camp, with the intention of carrying out some kind of ritual sacrifice. The storm had just provided him with the perfect cover, the perfect excuse to keep them isolated and under his control. And if I hadn't shown up when I did, if Iris hadn't managed to call for help, all of them might have died. I thanked Marcus and ended the call, then sat there in my kitchen trying to make sense of it all. But some things, I was learning, don't make sense. Some evil is so random, so inexplicable, that all you can do is stop it when you encounter it and hope you're fast enough to save lives. I'd stopped Pastor Elias Stormcrow, and I'd saved 4 people. That would have to be enough. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Because somewhere out there in the vast swamp of Big Cypress there were more secrets buried in the mud and tangled in the trees. And I had a feeling that what happened at Camp Resurrection was just the beginning. The administrative leave lasted 3 days, which was standard procedure for an officer-involved shooting. I spent most of that time at home, trying to rest, but finding it impossible to quiet my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chapel, saw Pastor Elias Stormcrow with that knife raised, saw the terror on Iris Moonwalker's face. The shooting had been ruled justified. There was no question about that. But justified didn't mean easy. I'd taken a life, and no matter how necessary it had been, that weight didn't just disappear because some investigator signed off on a report. On the 4th day, I returned to the station. The other officers were respectful but distant, the way people get around someone who's been through trauma. They didn't know what to say to me, and I didn't know what I wanted them to say, so we all just went about our business and pretended everything was normal. But it wasn't normal, and it wouldn't be for a long time. Marcus Silvercloud called me into his office that morning and told me he wanted to brief me on the ongoing investigation into Camp Resurrection and Pastor Stormcrow's activities. Marcus had a folder spread across his desk, filled with photos and documents, and he gestured for me to sit down. He said they'd been digging into Pastor Stormcrow's background, trying to understand how a seemingly normal religious leader had turned into someone capable of planning ritualistic murder. What they'd found was disturbing. About 3 months ago, Pastor Stormcrow had visited a rare bookshop in Tampa, a place that specialized in occult and religious texts. The owner remembered him because he'd spent over 2 hours browsing and had eventually purchased an extremely expensive book, something the owner described as a 17th century manuscript dealing with purification rituals and blood sacrifice. The book itself was now in evidence, and Marcus showed me photos of some of the pages. They were written in a mix of Latin and what looked like archaic English, with detailed illustrations of rituals that made my stomach turn. There were diagrams showing how to prepare a sacred space, instructions for selecting and preparing sacrificial victims, and prayers meant to invoke divine favor through the shedding of blood. The text claimed these rituals were the true path to spiritual enlightenment, that modern religion had been corrupted and softened, and that only through returning to these ancient practices could one achieve true communion with God. I asked Marcus if there was any way to track where the book had come from originally, who'd written it, or what group had used it. He shook his head and said the bookshop owner had purchased it from an estate sale in Georgia about 5 years ago, and there was no clear provenance before that. The manuscript itself appeared to be a copy of an even older text, possibly dating back to some fringe religious movement in colonial America. What was clear was that Pastor Stormcrow had taken its teaching seriously, had become convinced that he was called to carry out these rituals, and had selected his own congregation as the victims. Marcus then showed me something else that made my blood run cold. They'd found more carved symbols around Camp Resurrection, not just near the ravine where Tom had died, but scattered throughout the property. The symbols matched illustrations in the book, and forensic analysis suggested they'd been carved at different times over the past 6 weeks. Pastor Stormcrow had been visiting the camp regularly, preparing it, sanctifying it according to the instructions in the manuscript. The spiritual retreat he'd organized wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of months of planning. I asked Marcus if they'd found any connection between Pastor Stormcrow and other people who might share his beliefs, any indication that this was part of a larger group or movement. He said they were still investigating, but so far, it appeared Stormcrow had been acting alone. His congregation had been small, maybe 20 regular attendees, and interviews with them revealed that none of them had known about his dark turn. He'd kept that part of his life completely hidden, maintaining his role as a caring, passionate pastor while secretly preparing for mass murder. The revelation that this had been planned made everything feel worse somehow. It wasn't just a psychotic break triggered by stress and isolation. It was premeditated, calculated, and that suggested a level of commitment to his twisted beliefs that was truly frightening. Marcus told me they were bringing in experts, religious scholars, and psychologists to analyze the manuscript and provide insight into Stormcrow's mindset. But for now, the working theory was that he'd become radicalized by the text, convinced himself that he was carrying out God's will, and had used the storm as an opportunity to execute his plan. Before I left Marcus's office, he mentioned one more detail that stuck with me. When they'd searched Pastor Stormcrow's apartment, they'd found a list of names, members of his congregation with check marks next to 5 of them. Those 5 names were Iris Moonwalker, David, Sarah, Michelle, and the couple Tom and Linda. They were the people who'd agreed to attend the retreat, and they'd been specifically selected. Marcus said they were trying to figure out what criteria Stormcrow had used to choose them, whether it was random or based on some perceived spiritual quality. The congregation members who hadn't been chosen were being interviewed to see if there was any pattern. I left the station that afternoon feeling more disturbed than when I'd arrived. The case was officially closed as far as my involvement went. The shooting had been ruled justified, and the investigation into Stormcrow's activities was being handled by detectives and federal authorities. But I couldn't let it go. Something about the whole situation bothered me, a nagging feeling that we were missing something important. I decided to do some investigating on my own, off the clock and off the record, just to satisfy my own need for answers. I started by visiting the rare bookshop in Tampa where Pastor Stormcrow had purchased the manuscript. It was a small place tucked into a side street, the kind of shop you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. The owner was an elderly man named Harold Ashford, thin and scholarly with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers. When I showed him my badge and explained why I was there, he invited me into his cluttered back office and offered me tea. Harold remembered Pastor Stormcrow vividly. He said the pastor had come in on a Saturday afternoon in early June, browsing the religious texts section with an intensity that had caught his attention. Most customers in that section were academics or collectors, people who appreciated the historical value of the books but didn't necessarily believe their contents. But Pastor Stormcrow had been different. He'd asked Harold specifically if he had anything dealing with early American religious practices, particularly texts that dealt with sacrifice and purification. Harold had been hesitant at first. Those kinds of books attracted a certain type of customer that he preferred to avoid. But Pastor Stormcrow had been insistent and had the money to back up his interest. Harold had shown him the manuscript, explaining that it was likely a copy made in the late 1600s of an even older text, and that it had come from an estate sale with very little documentation. Pastor Stormcrow had spent 2 hours reading it, sitting in a corner of the shop and taking notes, before finally purchasing it for $1,200. Harold said he'd felt uneasy about the sale even then, something about the pastor's intensity and the way he'd talked about the text being a revelation. But he'd told himself he was just selling a historical artifact, not enabling anything dangerous. I asked Harold if anyone else had ever inquired about similar texts, if there was a market for this kind of material. He admitted there was a small but dedicated group of collectors and practitioners who sought out occult and esoteric religious texts. Most of them were harmless, academics or history enthusiasts, but occasionally someone would come in who seemed genuinely committed to the practices described in the books. Harold said he tried to screen his customers, to refuse sales to people who seemed unstable or dangerous, but it wasn't always easy to tell who might actually use the information. Before I left, I asked Harold if he still had records of other books he'd sold from that estate sale, thinking there might be a connection. He checked his files and found that he'd acquired about 30 books from the sale, most of them dealing with colonial American history and religion. He'd sold about half of them over the past 5 years to various collectors, and he gave me a list of the buyers who'd purchased similar texts. I thanked him and left, adding the list to my growing file of information. Next, I decided to visit some of the congregation members who hadn't been selected for the retreat. I wanted to understand what had made Iris, David, Sarah, Michelle, Tom, and Linda different from the others, what Pastor Stormcrow had seen in them that made them targets. I started with a woman named Rebecca Swiftwater, who'd been attending Pastor Stormcrow's services for about 8 months. She lived in a modest apartment in Fort Myers and seemed genuinely shaken when I explained what had happened at Camp Resurrection. Rebecca told me that Pastor Stormcrow had always been passionate and intense, but in a way that had felt inspiring rather than frightening. He'd talked a lot about sacrifice and commitment, about how modern Christianity had become too comfortable and too focused on earthly concerns. He'd challenged his congregation to go deeper, to really examine their faith and be willing to give up everything for God. Rebecca said she'd found his sermons moving, but she'd also felt like she couldn't quite meet his standards, like she wasn't devoted enough to be part of his inner circle. When I asked her if she'd been invited to the retreat, she said no, and she'd actually felt hurt about being excluded. Pastor Stormcrow had announced the retreat during a service about 2 months ago, describing it as an opportunity for his most committed followers to deepen their faith through isolation and intense spiritual work. He'd personally invited the 5 people who'd attended, plus 2 others who had declined due to work obligations. Rebecca said she'd asked if she could join, but Pastor Stormcrow had gently told her she wasn't ready yet, that she needed to work on her commitment before she could participate in such an intense experience. I interviewed 3 more congregation members and heard similar stories. Pastor Stormcrow had carefully selected the participants for the retreat, choosing people he perceived as the most devoted, the most willing to follow his guidance without question. It was a deliberate grooming process, building trust and dependency over months before finally isolating them in a place where he had complete control. The people who hadn't been chosen, like Rebecca, had actually been protected by their perceived lack of devotion. It was a chilling realization. My next stop was the estate sale company that had handled the sale where Harold Ashford had purchased the manuscript. It took some digging to find them, a small operation run by a husband and wife team named the River Songs, but eventually I tracked them down to an office in Sarasota. They were cooperative when I explained I was investigating a crime that involved a book from one of their sales, and they pulled up their records from 5 years ago. The estate had belonged to a man named Cornelius Blackwood, who'd died at age 87 with no living relatives. The River Songs said his house had been filled with books, thousands of them, covering every imaginable subject, but with a particular focus on religious history and occult practices. They'd spent weeks cataloging everything and had held multiple sales to liquidate the collection. Most of it had gone to dealers and collectors, people like Harold Ashford, and the house itself had eventually been sold to pay off Blackwood's debts. I asked if there were any records of who Cornelius Blackwood had been, what he'd done for a living, or why he'd accumulated such a massive collection. The River Song said they'd heard from neighbors that he'd been a professor of religious studies at a local college decades ago, but he'd retired in the 1980s and had lived alone ever since. He'd been described as eccentric but harmless, someone who kept to himself and spent all his time reading and writing. They gave me the address of his former house, and I decided to drive by, even though I wasn't sure what I hoped to find. The house was in an older neighborhood in Sarasota, a small, nondescript bungalow that looked like it hadn't been updated since it was built in the 1950s. The current owners were a young couple who'd bought it about 4 years ago and had been slowly renovating it. When I explained who I was and why I was interested in the house's previous owner, they invited me inside. They said they'd found a few things when they'd moved in, mostly old books and papers that had been left in the attic, and they'd kept them in boxes in case they were valuable. They brought the boxes down, and I spent an hour going through them. Most of it was academic material, lecture notes and research papers on topics like early American religious movements and colonial-era beliefs. But in the bottom of the third box, I found something that made my pulse quicken. It was a journal, handwritten in neat script, and it belonged to Cornelius Blackwood. The entries were dated from the 1960s through the early 2000s, and they detailed his fascination with a particular religious sect that had existed in Florida in the late 1600s. According to Blackwood's research, this sect had been founded by a charismatic preacher who'd broken away from the mainstream colonial churches, claiming he'd received direct revelations from God. The preacher, whose name was recorded as Jeremiah Ashford, had taught that salvation could only be achieved through blood sacrifice and ritual purification. He'd established a small community somewhere in what was now the Big Cypress area, and for about 10 years they'd practiced their beliefs in secret. But eventually, colonial authorities had gotten wind of what was happening, and they'd raided the community. Most of the members had been arrested and tried for heresy and murder, and Jeremiah Ashford had been executed. The sect had been largely forgotten, dismissed as a footnote in colonial history, but Cornelius Blackwood had become obsessed with it. His journal entries talked about trying to find the site of their community, collecting any surviving texts or artifacts, and understanding their beliefs. He'd even expressed admiration for their commitment, calling them true believers who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for their faith. And most disturbing of all, he'd written about creating a copy of one of their ritual texts, a manuscript he'd reconstructed from fragments and historical accounts. The manuscript he'd created was almost certainly the one Pastor Stormcrow had purchased. I photographed the relevant pages of the journal and thanked the homeowners, then drove back to the station. I needed to brief Marcus Silvercloud on what I'd found, and I needed to make sure this information became part of the official investigation. What I'd discovered suggested that Pastor Stormcrow hadn't just stumbled across some ancient evil text. He'd been infected by ideas that stretched back centuries, beliefs that had been kept alive through scholarship and obsession, passed down through books and manuscripts until they'd found a receptive mind. Marcus listened to my briefing without interrupting, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He said, "Tallman, you've done good work here, but you're also opening up a can of worms. If Blackwood created that manuscript and sold it through an estate sale, there's a chance other copies exist, or that other books from his collection contain similar material. We could be looking at the tip of an iceberg." I nodded and said that was exactly what worried me. How many other people had purchased books from that estate sale? How many of them might be reading the same poisonous ideas that had radicalized Pastor Stormcrow? Marcus said he'd coordinate with federal authorities to track down other buyers and do welfare checks, make sure no one else was planning something similar. He also said he'd have the manuscript examined by experts to determine if it was indeed a reconstruction or if it might be an authentic text from the 1600s. Either way, it needed to be documented and studied so law enforcement could recognize the signs if they encountered it again. I offered to help with the investigation, but Marcus gently told me I needed to step back, that I'd done enough and needed to focus on my own recovery. He was right, but I still felt restless, like there was more I should be doing. I left the station and drove home, but instead of going inside, I just sat in my truck and stared at my house. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something, that there was another layer to this that we hadn't uncovered yet. Pastor Stormcrow had been at Camp Resurrection for weeks before the retreat, carving symbols and preparing the space. Had anyone else been with him? Had he met anyone there, anyone who might have encouraged him or helped him plan? I made a decision that was probably stupid but felt necessary. I was going back to Camp Resurrection. Not officially, not as part of any investigation, but on my own time to look for anything we might have missed. I knew the forensics team had been thorough, but they'd been focused on the buildings and the immediate area. I wanted to search the surrounding forest, the places Pastor Stormcrow might have gone when he was alone. Maybe there was nothing to find, but I needed to try. The next morning, I loaded my truck with supplies and drove back out to County Road 846. The roads had dried out in the week since the storm, and the drive was much easier than it had been that terrible night. When I reached Camp Resurrection, I saw that the place had been secured with police tape and no trespassing signs, but there was no one guarding it. The tribal council had decided to leave it abandoned, considering it too expensive to renovate and too tainted by recent events to be worth saving. I ducked under the police tape and started my search. I avoided the main buildings, those had been thoroughly examined, and instead focused on the trails leading away from the camp. I followed the same path I'd taken to find Tom's body, and when I reached the ravine, I spent time examining the area more carefully. The symbols carved into the trees were still visible, and I photographed them from multiple angles. Then I followed the stream upstream, thinking Pastor Stormcrow might have explored in that direction. About half a mile from the ravine, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a small clearing, maybe 20 feet in diameter, and in the center was a circle of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern. Inside the circle, the ground had been scraped clean of vegetation, and there were more symbols carved into the exposed dirt. This wasn't something that could have been done recently. The vegetation around the circle had grown back over what looked like months or even years, suggesting this site had been here long before Pastor Stormcrow had ever set foot in the camp. I took extensive photos and then started searching the perimeter of the clearing. That's when I found the grave. It was partially hidden under a fallen log, just a slight depression in the ground that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I moved the log carefully and saw that the earth had been disturbed relatively recently, within the past year or so. I didn't have tools to excavate properly, so I called Marcus Silvercloud and told him what I'd found. He said he'd send a team out immediately. The excavation took place the following day, and I was there to watch. What they uncovered made national news. There were 3 bodies buried in that clearing, all of them badly decomposed but identifiable through dental records. They were people who'd gone missing from the area over the past 5 years. 2 men and a woman, all of them transients or drifters with no close family. And all of them had died from knife wounds to the chest. The same method Pastor Stormcrow had been planning to use on his congregation. The revelation was staggering. Pastor Stormcrow hadn't just been planning his first ritual sacrifice at Camp Resurrection. He'd already carried out multiple killings, perfecting his technique and his ritual, choosing victims who wouldn't be missed. The retreat with his congregation was supposed to be his grand finale, the moment when he finally sacrificed people he cared about, people he considered worthy of the honor. It explained why he'd been so confident, so calm during those final moments. He'd done this before. The investigation exploded in scope after that discovery. Federal agents descended on the area, searching for more burial sites and trying to track Pastor Stormcrow's movements over the past 5 years. They found evidence that he'd been visiting Camp Resurrection regularly, sometimes staying for days at a time, always alone. He'd used the abandoned camp as his personal sanctuary, a place where he could practice his beliefs without fear of discovery. And that clearing, that circle of stones, hadn't been created by him. It had been there already, possibly for decades or even centuries, a remnant of that 1600 sect that Cornelius Blackwood had been so obsessed with. The working theory was that Pastor Stormcrow had discovered the site during one of his explorations of Big Cypress, had recognized it from his studies of the manuscript, and had become convinced that he was meant to carry on the work of Jeremiah Ashford and his followers. The site itself had become sacred to him, proof that his beliefs weren't just theoretical but part of a living tradition that stretched back through time. And finding those 3 transient victims had been easy because he'd offered them shelter and food, lured them out to the camp with promises of help, and then killed them as part of his ritualistic practices. I attended the press conference where all of this was announced, standing in the back and watching as Marcus Silvercloud and a federal agent laid out the timeline of Pastor Stormcrow's crimes. The public was horrified, and the congregation he'd once led was devastated, learning that the man they'd trusted had been a serial killer. Iris Moonwalker released a statement saying she and the other survivors were cooperating with the investigation and trying to come to terms with how thoroughly they'd been deceived. As for me, I received a commendation for my actions during the storm and for my follow-up investigation that had led to discovering the burial site. The department wanted to hold a ceremony, but I declined. I didn't feel like I deserved recognition for shooting a man, even if that man had been a monster. What I felt was tired, hollowed out, and deeply disturbed by how close we'd come to losing 4 more people to Pastor Stormcrow's madness. The one question that haunted me, the one that kept me awake at night, was whether there were others like him out there. People who'd purchased books from Cornelius Blackwood's collection. People who'd been radicalized by those ancient, poisonous ideas. People who were even now planning their own rituals and selecting their own victims. Marcus assured me that authorities were tracking down every buyer from that estate sale, interviewing them and confiscating any dangerous materials. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting a battle we couldn't win, that ideas like the ones in that manuscript couldn't be contained by police work alone. All I could do was my job. Keep patrolling Big Cypress, keep responding to calls, and hope that if I ever encountered something like this again, I'd be ready. But deep down, I knew that no one is ever really ready for the kind of evil that hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability and faith while plotting murder in secret. Camp Resurrection was closed now, condemned and scheduled for demolition. But the darkness that had lived there, the darkness that had infected Pastor Elias Stormcrow and driven him to kill, that darkness was still out there, waiting for the next vulnerable mind to infect. And that thought terrified me more than anything else. 3 months passed after the discovery of the burial site at Camp Resurrection, and life on the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation slowly returned to something resembling normal. The media circus died down. The federal investigation concluded its initial phase, and I went back to my regular patrol duties. But normal was a relative term. I still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, seeing Pastor Elias Stormcrow's face in those final moments before I pulled the trigger. The department had mandated counseling sessions, and I went to them dutifully, talking through the trauma with a therapist who specialized in officer-involved shootings. It helped, marginally, but there were some things that therapy couldn't fix. What bothered me most wasn't the shooting itself. It was the knowledge that Pastor Stormcrow had been operating right under our noses for years, killing transients and perfecting his rituals while maintaining his cover as a respected religious leader. How many other people like him were out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment? The federal task force that had been formed to track down buyers from Cornelius Blackwood's estate sale had made some progress, interviewing dozens of collectors and confiscating several dangerous texts. But so far, they hadn't found anyone else who'd acted on the beliefs outlined in those books. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It just meant they hadn't been caught yet. I was finishing up a routine traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon when dispatch called. It was Hazel Nightwind, her voice calm but with an edge of urgency. She said, "Tallman, we've got a welfare check request from the sheriff's office in Hendry County. They're asking if we can assist with a situation at a property just inside our jurisdiction boundary. Apparently, some hikers reported seeing disturbing activity at an old homestead near Devil's Garden." I told Hazel I'd take the call and asked her to send me the coordinates. She rattled them off, and I punched them into my GPS. The location was about 20 miles east of where I was, deep in the swamp where few people ventured. The drive took almost 40 minutes, the last 10 miles on dirt roads that were barely maintained. The property in question was set back from the road, accessible only by a narrow track that wound through dense palmetto and cypress trees. When I finally arrived, I saw what had concerned the hikers. The homestead consisted of a single small house, weathered and sagging, surrounded by overgrown land. But what caught my attention was the series of wooden posts driven into the ground in a wide circle around the property, each one carved with symbols that made my stomach drop. They were the same symbols I'd seen at Camp Resurrection, the same markings from the manuscript Pastor Stormcrow had used. I radioed dispatch and requested backup, telling Hazel I'd found something that needed immediate investigation. She acknowledged and said a unit would be en route within 30 minutes. I decided to wait rather than approach the house alone. I'd learned my lesson about rushing into unknown situations, especially when those situations involved ritualistic symbols and isolated properties. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing where I had a clear view of the house and settled in to watch. About 10 minutes later, I saw a movement inside the house. A shadow passed by one of the windows, and then the front door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, and even from a distance I could see he was looking directly at my truck. He was in his 50s, tall and lean, with long gray hair tied back, and he was wearing what looked like homemade clothing, rough spun fabric that hung loosely on his frame. He raised one hand in a wave, not threatening but not exactly friendly either, and then he started walking toward me. I got out of my truck, my hand resting on my weapon but not drawing it, and met him halfway across the clearing. I identified myself as Seminole Tribal Police and asked him his name. He said his name was Silas Wanderer, and this was his property. His voice was soft and measured, the kind of voice that made you lean in to hear what he was saying. I told him I was responding to a welfare check that hikers had reported concerning activity at this location. Silas smiled slightly and said, "The posts, I assume. People see them and get worried. But there's nothing to be concerned about, officer. They're part of my spiritual practice, nothing more." I asked him what kind of spiritual practice involved carving symbols into posts and arranging them in circles, and he invited me to come inside and talk. I declined and said I'd rather wait for my backup to arrive before we continued the conversation. Silas nodded, understanding, and said he'd wait with me. We stood there in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes, and I used the time to study him more carefully. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years living rough, and his eyes had that distant, unfocused quality I'd seen in Pastor Stormcrow's eyes. It was the look of someone who'd gone deep into their own beliefs and come back changed. When my backup arrived, 2 officers I knew named Kate Firecloud and Daniel Runningbrook, I briefed them quickly on what I'd found and what Silas had told me. Kate suggested we do a walkthrough of the property to make sure there was nothing illegal or dangerous, and Silas consented without hesitation. He led us around the perimeter first, showing us the posts and explaining that they were boundary markers meant to create a sacred space. The symbols carved into them were protective, he said, meant to keep out negative energy and create a sanctuary for meditation and prayer. I photographed each post and noted the symbols. They were definitely similar to the ones from Camp Resurrection, but not identical. Some were the same, but others were variations or entirely different designs. When I asked Silas where he'd learned about these symbols, he said he'd been studying indigenous spirituality and pre-colonial religious practices for decades, trying to reconstruct what he called the original faith of the land. He'd collected books, manuscripts, and oral histories from various sources, and he'd synthesized them into his own personal practice. We moved on to the house, and Silas invited us inside. The interior was sparse but clean, with a few pieces of simple furniture and walls covered in hand-drawn maps and diagrams. One entire wall was dedicated to what looked like a genealogy chart, tracing various religious movements and sects from the 1600s through the present day. I recognized some of the names from my investigation into Pastor Stormcrow and Cornelius Blackwood, including Jeremiah Ashford and his sect. When I pointed this out to Silas, he nodded enthusiastically and said, "Yes, Ashford was a visionary, one of the few who understood the true nature of sacrifice and devotion." My blood ran cold. I asked Silas directly if he'd known Pastor Elias Stormcrow, and he paused before answering. He said, "I knew of him." We were both part of an online community, people interested in reconstructing and practicing these old faiths. When I heard what happened at the camp, I was saddened but not surprised. Elias had been struggling with the burden of his knowledge. and the storm had pushed him over the edge. I told Silas that Pastor Stormcrow hadn't just gone over the edge. He'd murdered people, and planning to murder more when I stopped him. Silas's expression didn't change. He said, "Sacrifice is part of many religious traditions, officer. What Elias did may seem extreme by modern standards, but in the context of his beliefs, he was being faithful." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level as I asked him if he condoned murder. He shook his head and said, "I don't condone or condemn. I simply observe that human morality is culturally constructed, and what we call murder in one context might be considered holy in another. That's not an excuse, just an observation." Kate Firecloud, who'd been quietly examining the room, called me over to a bookshelf in the corner. On it were dozens of books, many of them the same titles I'd seen in Harold Ashford's Rare Bookshop and in the inventory from Cornelius Blackwood's estate sale. There were also handwritten notebooks filled with ritual instructions, diagrams, and what looked like accounts of personal experiences. Kate opened one of the notebooks and showed me an entry dated 2 years ago. It described a ritual Silas had performed at a location he called the Old Ground, which I recognized as another name for the area around Camp Resurrection. I asked Silas if he'd been to Camp Resurrection, and he admitted he had, multiple times over the years. He said it was a sacred site, one of the few places where the old energy still lingered. He'd never harmed anyone there, he insisted. He'd only gone to meditate and perform personal rituals. When I asked him if he'd ever met Pastor Stormcrow at the site, he hesitated before saying yes. They'd encountered each other about a year ago, both drawn to the same clearing with the circle of stones. They'd talked for hours about their beliefs, their practices, and their interpretations of the old texts. I asked Silas if he'd known what Pastor Stormcrow was planning, if Stormcrow had told him about his intentions to sacrifice his congregation. Silas said he'd suspected Elias was moving in that direction, but he hadn't known specifics. He'd advised caution, told Elias to consider the consequences not just spiritually, but legally. But Elias had been convinced that he was meant to complete the work that Jeremiah Ashford had started, and Silas hadn't tried to stop him. When I asked why not, Silas said, "It wasn't my place to interfere with another person's spiritual journey, even if I disagreed with their methods." I looked at Kate and Daniel, and I could see they were thinking the same thing I was. Silas Wanderer might not have personally killed anyone, but his philosophy, his refusal to draw clear moral lines between right and wrong, had enabled Pastor Stormcrow's crimes. He'd known what was coming and had done nothing to prevent it. I asked Silas if there were others in this online community, other people who shared these beliefs and might be planning their own rituals. He said there were maybe a dozen active members scattered across the country, but most of them were armchair practitioners, people who studied the text academically without actually carrying out the practices. I asked for names, and Silas refused. He said he wouldn't betray the privacy of people who'd done nothing wrong. I told him that withholding information about potential criminals was obstruction of justice, and he calmly replied that until someone actually committed a crime, there was nothing to report. He was right, legally, but it was a frustrating technicality. Without evidence that these other community members were planning violence, we couldn't compel Silas to identify them. The best I could do was document what he'd told us and pass the information along to the federal task force. We continued our search of the property and found more disturbing materials. In a shed behind the house, Silas had what he called his ritual space, a small room with an altar, candles, and various ceremonial objects including knives and bowls. He insisted he used them only for personal rituals, cutting himself in small, symbolic ways to enact the purification practices described in the texts. He showed us scars on his arms and chest, dozens of them. thin white lines that formed intricate patterns. It was self-harm disguised as spirituality, and while it wasn't illegal for an adult to cut themselves, it was deeply disturbing. We also found journals documenting Silas's rituals over the past 15 years. He'd started with simple meditation and prayer, but had gradually incorporated more extreme practices, including prolonged fasting, sensory deprivation, and the cutting rituals he'd mentioned. The entries were detailed and clinical, describing his physical and mental states during and after each ritual, and they painted a picture of someone who'd slowly disconnected from consensus reality. Silas lived entirely within his own constructed spiritual framework, and that framework had no room for conventional morality or concern for others. After completing our search, I told Silas we'd be confiscating some of his materials as evidence and that he should expect follow-up visits from federal investigators. He accepted this calmly, saying he had nothing to hide and would cooperate fully. As we were loading the books and journals into our vehicles, I asked him one final question. I said, "Silas, do you think Pastor Stormcrow was wrong in what he did? Not legally wrong, but morally wrong?" He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "I think Elias was true to his beliefs, and that's all any of us can be. If his truth led him to take lives, then that was the path he walked. My truth is different, but I don't presume to judge his." That answer crystallized something for me. Silas Wanderer was dangerous not because he was violent himself, but because his ideology created permission structures for violence in others. By refusing to condemn Pastor Stormcrow's actions, by framing murder as simply another valid spiritual practice, he was providing intellectual cover for anyone who might be tempted to follow in Stormcrow's footsteps. And as long as people like Silas were out there spreading these ideas, there would always be the risk of another Pastor Stormcrow emerging. We left Silas at his homestead and drove back to the station in silence. When we arrived, I immediately contacted Marcus Silvercloud and briefed him on what we'd found. He said the federal task force would take over from here, conducting a thorough investigation into Silas Wanderer and his online community. In the meantime, Silas would be monitored, not arrested, but kept under surveillance to make sure he wasn't planning anything himself or helping others plan violence. It was the best we could do within the constraints of the law. That evening, I sat in my living room and thought about everything I'd learned over the past 3 months. Pastor Elias Stormcrow hadn't been an isolated case, a single, disturbed individual who'd somehow stumbled across dangerous ideas. He'd been part of a network, small and loosely connected, but real, of people who were actively working to revive and practice ancient, violent forms of worship. Some of them, like Silas, might never cross the line into actual violence, but others, like Stormcrow, would. And the question wasn't if it would happen again, but when and where. I pulled up my laptop and started researching the names Silas had mentioned, the other members of his online community that he'd refused to identify. It took hours of digging through forums and social media, following threads and connections. But eventually, I compiled a list of likely suspects. There was a woman in Oregon who ran a blog about pre-Christian sacrifice rituals, a man in Texas who'd been arrested years ago for desecrating a cemetery in what he called a purification rite, and several others scattered across the country. I sent the list to Marcus with a note explaining how I'd compiled it, and he thanked me but reminded me again that I needed to step back and let the professionals handle it. He was right, but stepping back felt like giving up. I'd seen firsthand what happened when these ideas took root in someone's mind, and I couldn't shake the responsibility I felt to prevent it from happening again. But I also knew I was just one cop in a small department, and this was a problem that extended far beyond my jurisdiction. All I could do was stay vigilant, watch for warning signs in my own community, and hope that the federal task force would be able to contain the threat before it spread further. 2 weeks after our encounter with Silas Wanderer, I got a call from Marcus. He said the task force had made several arrests, people who'd been planning rituals similar to what Pastor Stormcrow had carried out. One of them was in Georgia, a man who'd been stockpiling supplies and had detailed plans to abduct and sacrifice homeless people. Another was in New Mexico, a woman who'd been trying to recruit followers for what she called a return to authentic worship. The arrests had been made quietly, without media coverage, to avoid inspiring copycats or creating panic. Marcus also told me that Silas Wanderer had been taken into federal custody, not for any crime, but for protective custody and psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation had revealed that while Silas wasn't actively planning violence, his mental state had deteriorated to the point where he was a danger to himself. He was being held in a secure facility where he could receive treatment and where authorities could monitor him. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for. I'd wanted to see him prosecuted for his role in enabling Pastor Stormcrow, but it was something. The case officially closed a month later. The federal task force issued a report detailing their findings, acknowledging that there was a small but concerning network of individuals interested in reviving violent religious practices from America's colonial past. The report recommended increased monitoring of online communities discussing these topics, better information sharing between law enforcement agencies, and public education about the warning signs of religious radicalization. It was all sensible and bureaucratic, and I doubted it would make much difference. What stayed with me, what I couldn't forget, was the image of Iris Moonwalker kneeling before that altar with Pastor Stormcrow standing over her with a knife. She'd trusted him, believed in him, and he'd been planning to kill her as an act of devotion. That betrayal, that perversion of faith and trust, was something that haunted all of the survivors. I'd spoken to Iris a few times in the months after the incident, and she'd told me she couldn't step foot in a church anymore, couldn't pray without remembering that night. Pastor Stormcrow had stolen more than just lives. He'd stolen the faith and security of everyone who'd believed in him. I continued my regular patrol duties, responding to calls and handling routine police work. But I was changed by what had happened at Camp Resurrection. I paid more attention to the people in our community who kept to themselves, who had unconventional beliefs, who might be sliding toward the kind of isolation and radicalization that had consumed Pastor Stormcrow. I wasn't trying to police people's thoughts or beliefs, but I was trying to be aware, to catch warning signs before another tragedy unfolded. 6 months after the storm, I drove out to Camp Resurrection one last time. The tribal council had finally approved its demolition, and a crew was scheduled to start tearing down the buildings the following week. I wanted to see the place one more time before it was erased, to stand in that chapel where I'd taken a life and make peace with what had happened. The drive was familiar now, and when I arrived, the camp looked smaller and less threatening than it had that terrible night. I walked through the empty buildings, seeing them in daylight for the first time. The chapel was just a small, decaying room with rotting pews and a simple altar. There was nothing inherently evil about it, nothing that explained why Pastor Stormcrow had chosen this place for his dark work. It was just wood and nails and time, deteriorating like everything else in the swamp. The evil had been brought here by a human being, carried in his mind and his heart, and now that he was gone, the place was just sad and forgotten. I stood where I'd stood that night, where I'd fired the shots that ended Pastor Stormcrow's life, and I tried to feel something, regret or vindication or closure. But all I felt was tired of carrying the weight of what I'd seen and done, tired of knowing that there were more people like Stormcrow out there, tired of feeling like I was fighting a battle I could never win. I stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, and then I left, walking back to my truck without looking back. The demolition happened on schedule, and within a week, Camp Resurrection was reduced to rubble and hauled away. The land was left to return to swamp, and within a few months you couldn't tell there'd ever been buildings there. Nature reclaimed the space, covering the scars with new growth, and the only evidence of what had happened were the official reports and the memories of those who'd survived. But I knew, and Marcus knew, and the federal task force knew, that the real danger wasn't in abandoned buildings or isolated clearings in the swamp. It was in the ideas themselves, in the texts and manuscripts that continued to circulate, in the online communities where people radicalized each other with talk of purification and sacrifice and returning to authentic faith. Those ideas couldn't be demolished or hauled away. They persisted, passed from person to person, waiting for the right combination of isolation, mental illness, and opportunity to turn someone into the next Pastor Elias Stormcrow. I think about that sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. I think about all the Silas wanderers out there, living on the margins, practicing their rituals in private, convincing themselves that conventional morality doesn't apply to the spiritually enlightened. Most of them will never hurt anyone but themselves. But some of them, the ones who are just a little more damaged, just a little more isolated, just a little more convinced of their own righteousness, will cross that line. And when they do, it will be someone like me who has to stop them, who has to make the split-second decision to take a life in order to save others. I don't regret shooting Pastor Stormcrow. Given the same situation, I'd do it again without hesitation. But I do regret that we live in a world where such decisions are necessary, where faith can be twisted into justification for murder, where ancient texts written by disturbed zealots can still reach across centuries to poison modern minds. Camp Resurrection is gone, reduced to nothing and reclaimed by the swamp. But the darkness that lived there, the ideology that drove Pastor Stormcrow to kill, that's still out there. And I know with absolute certainty that I haven't seen the last of it. All I can do is what I've always done. Put on my uniform, check my weapon, and patrol the roads and swamps of Big Cypress Seminole Reservation. I watch for signs of trouble, respond to calls, and try to protect the people in my community from harm. It's not glamorous work, and most days nothing happens. But I stay ready, because I know that somewhere out there, maybe in another abandoned camp or isolated homestead, someone is reading the wrong book, embracing the wrong ideas, and planning the wrong kind of sacrifice. And when that happens, when the call comes in and I'm dispatched to another welfare check or another suspicious activity report, I'll respond, I'll do my job, and if I'm lucky, I'll get there in time to stop another tragedy before it unfolds. But luck is a thin shield against the kind of evil that hides in plain sight. And I know better than most that sometimes, no matter how fast you respond or how well you're trained, you arrive just a little too late. The storm at Big Cypress is over. The rain has stopped, the winds have died down, and the floodwaters have receded. But the damage it revealed, the bodies buried in secret and the ideology that put them there, that's permanent. That's something we'll be dealing with for years, maybe decades, as we try to understand how someone like Pastor Elias Stormcrow could exist in our community without anyone noticing. And the hardest truth is this: he wasn't that unusual. There are others like him, maybe hundreds of them across the country, and we won't know who they are until they act. So I keep working, keep watching, and keep hoping that the next time I'm called to an abandoned camp in the middle of a storm, I'll arrive in time to save everyone. But deep down, I know that hope is all I have. Hope and a loaded weapon, and the memory of what happened the last time I wasn't quite fast enough. The swamp keeps its secrets, but sometimes, during storms, it gives them back. And what it revealed at Camp Resurrection is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. The knowledge that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing human faces, and that the only thing standing between them and their victims is people like me, flawed and exhausted, but still trying to do what's right. That's all we can do. That's all we've ever been able to do.